Hello, my dear friends. They rubbed wine on their necks, brushed teeth with soot, and washed their skin with whiskey, and somehow it worked. In the world of Victorian hygiene, filth and elegance coexisted so closely that it's hard to tell which one truly defined them. Each strange ritual, from hanging herbs in the toilet to massaging feet with potato peels, carried its own twisted logic of beauty and survival. Tonight, you'll step quietly into their world, where the pursuit of cleanliness was far stranger than you could ever imagine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into a quiet Victorian bedroom in the early hours of the morning, before the city's noise had yet reached its windows, they might find a woman standing before a small wooden basin. The light would be dim, filtered through curtains that had not been washed in months. On the washstand beside her would sit a chipped bottle of vinegar, its sharp scent cutting through the heavy air. She would dip a square of linen into the liquid, wring it carefully, and then press it against her skin. There was no soap, no perfume, only the sting of vinegar and the hope that it would make her feel clean enough to face the day. For most women, this ritual was less about luxury and more about necessity. Bathing was rare, and warm water was a privilege that not every household could afford. Vinegar became a substitute for both cleanliness and control, a way to fight the odours that came from layers of fabric, sweat, and time. The vinegar burned slightly as it touched the skin, leaving a faint sour smell that faded after a few minutes. Women convinced themselves that this meant it was working, that the sting was proof of its power. In truth, vinegar did kill some bacteria, though never enough to erase the constant reality of grime. Still, it was better than nothing. To smell faintly of vinegar was considered preferable to smelling of sweat. It is almost funny that the very scent we now associate with salad dressing was once the mark of good hygiene and social respectability. In narrow parlours and crowded carriages, the faint tang of vinegar became part of the atmosphere of daily life. It was not pleasant, but it was familiar, and familiarity was often mistaken for comfort. There were practical reasons for its use as well. Vinegar was cheap, easy to find, and stored well without spoiling. Housewives kept bottles of it for cooking, cleaning, and health remedies, and a little extra each morning seemed harmless enough. The belief that it purified the body fit perfectly within Victorian ideals of order and restraint. Cleanliness was not simply a physical matter, but a moral one. A woman who smelled unpleasant risked not only embarrassment but judgment. A single whiff of unwashed skin could ruin her reputation faster than a rumour, and so, every morning, she dabbed at her armpits and neck, wincing slightly at the sting, convinced that pain was part of being proper. If one were to imagine this in modern times, it would be like watching someone use window cleaner as deodorant and calling it sophistication. Yet in the Victorian mind, vinegar was almost scientific, a liquid that bridged the gap between cleanliness and modesty. It did not require nudity, unlike bathing, and it left no visible mark except a faint shine on the skin. It was private, discreet, and therefore acceptable. In a world where even speaking of the body was indecent, vinegar offered a silent solution. No one questioned why the house smelled faintly sour in the mornings. Everyone simply accepted it as a sign of diligence. The process was often repeated throughout the day, especially in summer. Under layers of corsets, petticoats, and long sleeves, the body sweated constantly. The fabric trapped heat, and the smell of stale perspiration mixed with perfume became unbearable. To wipe with vinegar was to reclaim a sense of control, however brief. Some women carried small cloths soaked in it inside their reticules, ready for moments when they needed to freshen themselves. It was a small act of survival in a world that demanded composure at all times. Men had their colognes and powders, women had vinegar. The science behind it, though rudimentary, was not entirely wrong. Vinegar's acidity killed some bacteria responsible for body odour. What Victorians lacked was an understanding of balance. Too much vinegar irritated the skin, causing rashes and burns under the arms, yet discomfort was almost fashionable. Enduring pain was part of being proper, whether from tight corsets or stinging vinegar. Cleanliness was rarely comfortable, but comfort was never the goal. Respectability required effort, and effort was often mistaken for virtue. There is something strangely admirable in their determination to feel clean in a world that offered them so few means to be so. The image of a woman carefully wiping her skin with vinegar, her face calm despite the sting, says much about Victorian endurance. They accepted the discomfort of their habits because they believed that purity, of body and of spirit, was something to be earned, even through pain. The vinegar, though simple, became part of their armour, a ritual as symbolic as it was practical. In poorer neighbourhoods, vinegar served not only as a personal cleanser but also as a household disinfectant. It was used to wipe tables, wash babies, and scrub floors. The same cloth might touch the armpit and the kitchen counter, yet no one saw the contradiction. The line between cleanliness and contamination was blurred. What mattered was the appearance of effort. As long as something was wiped, it was believed to be clean. The sharp smell of vinegar was proof enough. It was the scent of diligence, the perfume of poverty dressed as respectability. Vendors in markets sold vinegar in small bottles, often diluted and sometimes tinted with herbs to make it appear refined. Advertisements in women's magazines praised it as a cure for odours, blemishes, and even melancholy. They promised that vinegar could restore youth and purity, as if the body could be scoured into virtue. Housewives bought it faithfully, encouraged by the idea that something so common could carry such promise. The belief was comforting, even when the results were not. To an observer today, the ritual might seem absurd, even tragic. We wash daily with soaps, perfumes, and endless products designed to erase the body's natural scent. Yet the impulse remains the same. Modern society still hides its sweat behind chemicals and branding, just as Victorians hid theirs behind vinegar and silence. The tools have changed, but the unease with our own humanity has not. Cleanliness has always been a form of control, and control has always been a kind of illusion. In the stillness of a Victorian morning, the act of wiping one's skin with vinegar might have seemed insignificant, but it carried the weight of survival. It was a defence against judgment, against disease, against the feeling of helplessness in a dirty world. To live respectably was to appear clean, even when everything around was covered in soot and decay. Vinegar offered the illusion of purity, and sometimes illusion was enough to keep one going. The scent lingered faintly in the air after she finished, mixing with the smell of linen and coal smoke. She dressed carefully, layer upon layer, sealing in the residue of the ritual. As she stepped into the street, she blended into a crowd of others who had done the same, each carrying the faint, sour mark of morning discipline. The city was alive, and beneath the sound of carriages and footsteps hung the quiet proof of countless small acts of cleansing that defined an age obsessed with appearances. The vinegar left its sour scent behind, but it gave Victorians the illusion of cleanliness. It was a small comfort in lives where true hygiene was rare, somewhere nearby. Another curious ritual was being prepared with equal conviction, one that turned from the armpit to the feet, and from sourness to soot. Shoes in Victorian streets rarely had a chance to stay clean. The roads were caked with mud, horse droppings, and the black dust of coal smoke that fell from the sky. Every step left a trace of that world behind, clinging to leather and cloth, mixing with sweat trapped inside the shoe. For those who walked long hours each day, the smell that built up was impossible to ignore. When washing shoes was not an option and soap was a luxury, charcoal powder became a quiet saviour. It was simple, cheap, and easy to find. Housewives kept small sacks of it by the stove, meant for fires, yet a handful would often be taken aside and crushed fine for another purpose. That same black dust, which stained hands and chimneys, was now poured into shoes in the name of hygiene. People believed that charcoal could draw out impurities, that it swallowed odours and sickness alike. When sprinkled inside shoes, it absorbed the dampness left by hours of walking. The black grains clung to the lining and to the skin, leaving faint smudges on stockings, but no one cared. It was not about beauty, It was about survival through another day without embarrassment. There is something almost comic about the idea that people fought filth with soot and still called it cleanliness. Yet, in its strange way, it worked. The powder dried the sweat, muffled the smell, and gave people the illusion of control over something that was otherwise constant and unpleasant. Most Victorians owned a few pairs of shoes. A single pair might serve for years, patched and polished until it nearly fell apart. They were rarely removed during the day, and often worn indoors to keep feet warm on cold floors. In such conditions, moisture never truly disappeared. Charcoal became a modest miracle, offering a defense against rot and shame. Servants used it after long hours of standing in kitchens, their feet swollen and hot. Factory workers dusted their boots before setting out for another shift. It was a trick that crossed classes, practiced quietly but faithfully. To imagine it now is like watching someone pour barbecue ash into sneakers and calling it advanced foot care. Yet in the context of its time, it made perfect sense. There was little access to soap or powder, and medicine still believed in a balance between dryness and disease. If moisture bred illness, then dryness was purity. The black dust became a form of armour, invisible once the shoes were on. Every step ground the powder deeper, and with it came a small, invisible comfort. The world outside was dirty. At least the inside of one's shoes could feel clean. The market sold charcoal in small paper packets, sometimes mixed with herbs or perfumed with lavender to disguise its nature. Sellers promised fresh feet for every gentleman, though the result was far from fragrant. Still, the faint scent of smoke and earth was preferable to the sourness of unwashed feet. Housewives stored jars of crushed charcoal on shelves, beside vinegar bottles and soap scraps, all tools in their endless battle against smell. They wiped the inside of boots with damp cloths dusted in charcoal, believing the black streaks meant the odour was gone. It was not elegance, but efficiency, a kind of domestic alchemy that turned waste into remedy. Shoemakers sometimes encouraged the practice, if only to keep customers from complaining. They lined the soles with thin layers of powdered carbon, claiming it made shoes last longer. No one knew whether it was true, but people wanted to believe. The black dust had become a symbol of thrift and cleverness, proof that even the poor could maintain some dignity. To be respectable was not about being clean, but about trying to appear so. I find it strangely human how much faith they placed in such simple things, and how that faith gave them the courage to face their days. For children, the sight of their mothers shaking black powder into shoes was familiar, almost comforting. The smell of charcoal mixed with the air of every home, as common as the smoke that drifted from chimneys. In winter, when damp socks steamed beside the hearth, the charcoal smell grew stronger, wrapping the room in something that felt both dirty and safe. To them, it was the smell of warmth, of shoes drying after rain, of another day survived. The powder left marks on floors and stockings, and some complained that it ruined the look of fine clothing, but appearances mattered less than comfort. Few could afford both shoes and shame. In a society obsessed with manners, even a simple act like removing one's shoes could reveal poverty or neglect. Charcoal provided a shield against that humiliation. It lets people step into public spaces without fear of being judged by smell. That was enough reason to keep using it. The practice spread from house to house, whispered as advice between neighbours. It required no explanation, only imitation. The poor copied the middle class, and the middle class copied the wealthy, though all used the same black dust in the end. The boundaries of class dissolved briefly under the shared goal of not offending the nose of another. In that sense, charcoal was democratic. Everyone stank, and everyone sought the same solution. Charcoal's quiet usefulness extended beyond shoes. Some people brushed their teeth with it, rubbed it on their skin, even drank it in mixtures to cure stomach illness. Its power lay not in science, but in belief. To live in the Victorian era was to trust appearances and habits more than knowledge. Cleanliness had to be seen, or at least smelled, to be real. The black powder provided that illusion. The faint dryness it left behind felt like evidence of success. The fact that it came from the same fires that blackened the skies of London did not matter. Over time, reformers began to question such methods. They spoke of soap, of hygiene, of progress. But progress was slow to reach those who could not afford it. For many, charcoal remained the only option, the only tool that could turn shame into confidence. The act of sprinkling it became a ritual, repeated daily, passed down silently from mother to daughter, worker to apprentice. Its simplicity was its strength, its darkness its disguise. Charcoal hid the signs of labour, absorbed the odour of poverty, and allowed people to walk with a sense of quiet pride. In a world that demanded grace from those who had nothing, that small gift was precious. The powder did not heal or cleanse in truth, but it made life more bearable, one step at a time. The black dust left no glory behind, but it gave the illusion of purity to those who needed it most. It was a humble fix in a world too proud to admit its own filth. Beyond the doors of those same homes, another method of cleanliness was waiting, one that hung hidden beneath the folds of every woman's dress, releasing scents of herbs and quiet superstition. Underneath the layers of fabric that defined Victorian fashion, something secret often hung close to the skin. Small bundles of dried herbs, sage, rosemary, lavender, were tied with thin threads and tucked beneath skirts, pinned near the waist, or hidden under petticoats. They were meant to do more than scent the air. These little charms served as shields against odour, disease, and sometimes misfortune. The belief was that nature itself could purify what soap and water could not. A faint herbal fragrance drifting from a woman's gown was not simply pleasant. It was a sign of care, of quiet refinement, and of a wish to remain untouched by the dirt of the city. In drawing rooms and carriages, where close contact was inevitable, the scent of herbs was both protection and disguise. The act of preparing these bundles was almost ritualistic. Women dried herbs by the hearth, carefully separating leaves and flowers before wrapping them in cloth. Each mixture carried its own meaning. Sage promised strength, rosemary suggested purity, lavender spoke of calm. Some women preferred stronger combinations, like thyme or mint, while others used petals from roses long since faded. It is almost humorous that they pinned bouquets beneath layers of heavy clothing and still called it subtlety. Yet in a world without deodorant or perfume sprays, this was innovation. A hidden bouquet offered both scent and symbolism. It said, "I am clean," even if the body beneath had not felt water for weeks. The scent clung faintly to the air as its wearer moved. It mixed with the smell of fabric, dust, and perspiration, creating something that felt strangely human and strangely comforting. The herbs lost their colour over time, fading to muted greens and browns, but their purpose remained. A handful of dried leaves could preserve dignity better than any cosmetic. They made women feel prepared, armed against embarrassment. In a society where even a hint of body odour could mark someone as uncivilized, these secret sachets offered peace of mind. There were other reasons, too. The Victorians believed strongly in the medicinal power of herbs. They thought certain plants could ward off illness simply by being nearby. Doctors spoke of miasmas, bad airs that spread disease. If a smell could carry sickness, then another smell might carry its cure. The logic was imperfect, but comforting. To compare it with today would be like wearing scented dryer sheets in your clothes and calling it healthcare. Still, within their limited understanding, it was an act of reason. Herbs were accessible, harmless, and affordable, a poor woman's version of luxury perfume. The practice also carried a certain intimacy. These bundles were not for display. They rested against the body, warmed by movement, their scent released slowly throughout the day. No one else had to know. It was a kind of privacy rare in an age obsessed with appearances. Even in poverty, a woman could possess something purely her own. The herbs whispered of self-respect, a hidden rebellion against the filth and scrutiny of the outside world. Servants sometimes gathered herbs from gardens or fields for their mistresses, drying them quietly while the household slept. In turn, they made smaller bundles for themselves from whatever scraps remained. The line between cleanliness and superstition blurred easily. What began as deodorant became charm. What began as hygiene became comfort. People carried sprigs of rosemary into church, placed lavender in coffins, and pinned sage to undergarments. Each act was both practical and symbolic, part of the rhythm of Victorian life. I can almost imagine the quiet satisfaction they must have felt, believing that a few dried leaves could defend them from decay and judgment alike. The irony, of course, is that beneath all the perfumes and propriety, the same human fears persisted. The fear of smell, of shame, of being seen as less than respectable. Herbs promised safety where none truly existed, but to believe in their power was to hold on to a fragment of control in a world defined by discomfort. Over time, the scent of herbs became associated with gentility. Even perfumers began imitating it, mixing extracts into oils and soaps sold in elegant bottles. What had begun as a homemade defence for poor women transformed into a fashionable affectation among the upper classes. The same rosemary once tied in kitchen rags now appeared as an ingredient in perfumes that claimed to embody purity and virtue. As always, what began in necessity ended in luxury. Yet even in drawing rooms lined with marble and velvet, the logic remained the same to hide the body's truth beneath a more acceptable fragrance. When the herbs wilted completely, they were replaced without thought. The act of renewal carried its own meaning, a fresh start, a small moment of self-care. It was one of the few aspects of hygiene that felt tender rather than harsh. There was no sting of vinegar, no scrape of charcoal, only the soft rustle of dried leaves. For a moment, the world seemed gentler. The fragrance, faint as it was, created the illusion of calm. It could not cleanse the body, but it soothed the mind. The bundles also became keepsakes, pressed between pages or hidden in drawers long after their scent had faded. They carried memories of days when life was simpler, or perhaps merely quieter. Some women believed that keeping old sachets brought luck or preserved beauty. Others burned them during illness, hoping the smoke would carry sickness away. In every form, the herbs remained companions in both cleanliness and superstition. These hidden bouquets did more than disguise odour. They reflected a longing for control, beauty, and order in a world of unpredictability. They gave scent to self-respect, shape to hope, and comfort to anxiety. A handful of leaves, crushed and dry, somehow bridged the gap between filth and grace. The faint smell of sage and lavender faded slowly through the folds of a dress, mingling with dust and sweat until only a trace remained. It was a small gesture of defiance against decay, fragrant and fleeting. In another corner of the same house, however, a different ritual of cleanliness was taking place, one that involved the skin, the corset, and a thin layer of fabric pressed too tightly against the body. Among the many strange habits born from the struggle to stay clean in Victorian times, few were as curious as wearing necklaces made of black peppercorns. They looked like something from a kitchen shelf rather than a jewellery box, yet people wore them proudly around their necks. Each bead was a dried pepper seed, strung together with thread and tied close to the skin. The necklace was believed to serve two purposes: to repel insects and to mask unpleasant odours. For people who lived in narrow streets filled with smoke, waste, and sweat, the idea that a spice could protect them from filth and disease was deeply comforting. It was not simply decoration, it was defence disguised as elegance. The faint aroma of pepper was thought to be sharp enough to drive away both pests and bad luck. The pepper necklace represented the peculiar marriage of superstition and practicality that shaped so much of Victorian hygiene. Doctors and street vendors alike claimed that pepper's natural heat could purify the air around the body. Women who wore it said that when they grew warm, The necklace released its scent, blending with the skin's moisture to form a kind of invisible shield. It was not entirely untrue. Pepper's pungent oils did discourage some insects, but its use went far beyond logic. It is almost endearing that people believed a handful of kitchen spices could protect them from the filth of an empire. Still, in a time when even soap could be unreliable, any promise of purity was welcome. Pepper was not expensive, but it carried a sense of exoticism. Imported from faraway colonies, it symbolized the reach of British power and the illusion of refinement. To wear it was to wear a piece of the empire itself, proof that civilization could be purchased and worn close to the heart. The contrast between its purpose and its symbolism was striking. Here was a substance meant to season food, now used to guard against odour, vanity wrapped around fear. In the damp alleys of London or the hot kitchens of Manchester, the pepper necklace was less about fashion and more about survival. If someone tried this today, it would look like a strange mix of folk medicine and eccentric fashion, the kind of thing sold in wellness stores for far too much money. Yet the Victorian version was not a luxury. It was a necessity made clever. Women who could not afford perfume or powder could still tie pepper seeds around their necks and feel civilized. The scent that clung to their skin was not floral, but sharp, earthy, and alive. To them, it was the smell of protection, of cleanliness, of hope against decay. The beads darkened over time, absorbing the oil and heat of the skin until they became almost polished. Each necklace grew unique with use, carrying the scent of both spice and sweat. It was said that when the pepper lost its bite, it had finished its work. The wearer would then burn the old string and make a new one, a quiet ritual that marked renewal. This small act turned hygiene into a ceremony. It was a kind of personal religion built from ordinary things, where faith and practicality blended so seamlessly that no one thought to separate them. Pepper necklaces were especially common among servants, washerwomen, and cooks, those who worked in heat, humidity, and unending labour. Their bodies were exposed to odours that no amount of washing could remove, and so they turned to this small trick for dignity. The scent might not have masked everything, but it made life more bearable. Some even believed that the pepper absorbed sickness from the body, its black colour drawing illness away like a magnet. Others saw it as a charm, a promise of endurance in lives defined by exhaustion. There is something quietly touching about their faith in such small defences. It shows how deeply the Victorians longed to control what they could not truly change: their bodies, their air, their place in a world that never stopped reminding them of dirt and death. Peppercorns, once crushed and scattered across tables, became symbols of resistance. They did not stop disease or odour entirely, but they gave comfort, and comfort was often all that people could hope for. For the wealthy, pepper necklaces took on another meaning. Jewellers began to copy them using dark glass or polished onyx, turning the poor woman's defence into a fashionable trinket. The irony was thick. What began as an attempt to cover sweat became a mark of sophistication. At dinner parties, the rich wore imitations of what the poor had invented out of necessity. It was a pattern repeated throughout Victorian life. Poverty created the habit, and privilege turned it into fashion. The pepper necklace was simply another example of how survival could be mistaken for style. In private moments, the scent of pepper might have felt almost intimate. Its warmth clung to the throat and chest, mingling with the heartbeat beneath. It was not delicate or gentle, but it was alive, and in a world obsessed with repression, even that was a small rebellion. This smell could not be hidden or ignored. It demanded recognition. For many, that was precisely the point. To wear pepper was to acknowledge one's own body in an age that demanded its denial. When the day ended, and the necklace was finally removed, the skin beneath often showed faint marks where the beads had pressed. The pepper scent lingered even after washing, a reminder of the day's labour and its quiet victories. In that simple act of removal, there was both relief and loss. The necklace had protected its wearer, or at least made her believe she was protected, and that belief was powerful enough to become truth in its own way. The black beads glimmered faintly under the light of gas lamps, small orbs of defiance strung against the grime of the city. Their scent was strong but fleeting, like the people who wore them, fragile yet determined to endure. The illusion of purity they offered was brief, but sometimes brief was enough. The empire ran on appearances, and these little strings of pepper fit perfectly within that lie. The pepper necklace stood as both charm and contradiction, part superstition, part practicality. It masked what could not be erased and gave pride to those who had little else. It spoke of a time when even spices had to serve as soap, and when the body itself was something to be hidden, tamed, and perfumed into obedience. The faint scent it left behind might have been small, but in its simplicity lay the truth of Victorian life, that survival was built from the most unlikely things. Beads of pepper hardened with time, their scent fading into silence, yet they told a story of endurance more honest than any perfume bottle could. It was an odour of defiance disguised as decorum. Somewhere within those same homes, another invention waited. A powder meant not to hang or shine, but to soothe the skin trapped beneath layers of lace and corset. Among the many hidden rituals that kept Victorian bodies functioning beneath layers of fabric, the use of powder stood out as both secret and essential. The air inside those heavy clothes was hot and stale, the corset pressing skin against fabric until every breath left a trace of sweat. In such conditions, irritation was inevitable. Red marks appeared under arms, between thighs, and beneath the rib cage. Soap was scarce, air was thick, and the body had nowhere to breathe. The answer came in the form of a soft white dust, powder made from starch, rice, or crushed chalk, gently tapped onto the skin before dressing. It left a dry, smooth surface where friction would have burned. For women who wore their discomfort like duty, this powder was salvation hidden in plain sight. Applying it was a private act, performed after washing with vinegar or wiping the skin with a damp cloth. The powder came in small tins or fabric sachets, sometimes scented faintly with rose or lavender. A woman would lift her arms, tilt forward, and dust the areas most likely to chafe. The powder clung to the warmth of her body, turning to a thin film that felt cool for a brief moment before disappearing. It is almost absurd that dust itself became a form of cleanliness. Yet in that world, it made perfect sense. To be powdered was to be cared for, to be prepared to endure another day of corsets and propriety. It did not cleanse, but it concealed, and concealment was often more valuable than purity. The corset was the powder's greatest enemy, and its greatest reason for existence. Worn tightly for shape and modesty, it trapped moisture in the folds of skin beneath. The constant rubbing caused heat rashes and sores that few spoke of aloud. To admit such suffering would have been indecent, even shameful. Instead, women reached for their powders in silence. A light dusting beneath the stays and straps meant the difference between endurance and agony. The fine particles absorbed sweat, reduced friction, and gave the illusion of freshness. What could not be washed away was covered, softened, or ignored. To compare it with today, it would be like spraying deodorant under armour and calling it comfort. Yet this ritual was far gentler, more deliberate. There was no scent strong enough to announce itself, no brand or bottle to display. It was a practice of discretion. The goal was not allure but survival. The Victorians understood the body as something to be managed quietly, never celebrated. Powder allowed them to maintain the appearance of composure while their bodies protested beneath the weight of fabric and expectation. The powder's texture mattered deeply. It had to be fine enough to vanish on contact, leaving no trace on clothing. Coarser powders scratched the skin and left white marks on corsets, betraying the very thing they were meant to hide. Women experimented endlessly, grinding starch or flour into softer dust, mixing it with herbs or perfume to create something both practical and personal. The act itself became soothing, a rare moment of self-attention in lives that offered little privacy. There was a quiet grace in the way they turned discomfort into ritual, and ritual into resilience. Servants often prepared these powders for their mistresses, shaking them into linen bags and pressing them under corsets during dressing. Yet the servants themselves, who endured more labour and heat, relied on the same remedy. They used coarser powder made from flour or ground clay, applied quickly before returning to work. In this small detail, the classes met both rich and poor, bound by the same skin and the same need for relief. Powder made no distinction. It simply absorbed what life demanded. The faint scent that lingered on the body was part of its charm. It gave the illusion of care, of time taken, even when none existed. Some powders were advertised as medicinal, claiming to prevent not just irritation but illness. Doctors recommended them for children and invalids, praising their drying effect. The body was seen as something to be dried, tightened, and contained. Moisture was weakness. Dryness was virtue. The more powder one used, the closer one seemed to moral purity. But there were risks too. Cheap powders were often contaminated with lead or chalk that irritated the skin further. Women scratched at their rashes, not realizing that the cure itself might be the cause. Yet to abandon the ritual was unthinkable. It had become part of identity, as essential as the corset itself. In a world where every movement was watched and every scent judged, powder offered silent protection from humiliation. To feel dry was to feel safe. The touch of powder also carried intimacy. It was one of the few forms of self-contact permitted to women of the time. Brushing the skin with soft dust felt like an act of tenderness, though they would never have called it that. It was the kind of care given in secret, meant for no one else to see. A mother might teach her daughter how to apply it properly, passing down not vanity but survival. Each puff of powder was both instruction and inheritance. As the day wore on, the powder's effect faded. Sweat and movement broke its thin hold, and by nightfall, the body felt sticky again. Yet the act of reapplying it before bed was soothing, like closing a day with a small act of control. The faint rustle of powder falling onto skin was the sound of persistence. It spoke of endurance, of women who managed their bodies quietly while the world admired their poise. Powder became the invisible line between comfort and collapse. It was a remedy that left no trace, an answer made from the simplest material, dust. In its softness lay strength, and in its use, a reflection of how much people could adapt to the weight of their own customs. The scent of starch and rosewater lingered long after the act itself, faint proof that someone had tried to remain whole beneath the burden of beauty. Soft dust settled into silence, keeping the illusion of grace intact beneath corsets and gowns. It was a fragile comfort in a world that rewarded endurance over ease. Not far away. Another trick waited in the dim light, a liquid that burned on contact but promised to clean the skin faster than any soap could. The act of cleaning one's body with diluted whiskey might sound indulgent, yet in Victorian homes it was seen as practical science. Water was rarely pure, and soap was not always kind to the skin. Alcohol, however, promised both safety and sensation. It evaporated quickly, cooled the flesh, and carried a fragrance strong enough to outmatch sweat. A few spoonfuls of whiskey mixed with water became the makeshift cleanser for those who could not afford expensive tonics or who feared the germs of public baths. The sting of the alcohol was sharp, but to many it felt like proof of its power. A woman might stand before her washstand each morning, dip a cloth into the mixture, and wipe herself from neck to ankle. When the chill reached her chest, she would shiver, certain that the burn meant purity. Whiskey was not chosen for luxury. It was chosen because it worked. Alcohol dissolved oil and lifted grime, and its smell covered nearly everything else. The Victorians valued appearances above comfort, and a faint scent of whiskey was a small price for dignity. It is almost funny to imagine that people believed the same drink that numbed their sorrow could also cleanse their sins. Still, the idea was clever. Whiskey was cheap enough to find in taverns and strong enough to kill some bacteria. In the minds of its users, it bridged the gap between medicine and hygiene. A man who wiped himself with whiskey felt renewed. A woman who did so felt refined. The practice crossed every class. Servants used the cheapest spirits they could find, while the wealthy diluted fine whiskey in crystal bowls, adding rose petals or mint to soften its sting. Some claimed it tightened the pores and kept the skin smooth. Others simply liked the way it smelled. Bold, masculine, clean. For women who could not bathe daily, whiskey offered confidence in crowded rooms. The scent lingered faintly behind them, a perfume of necessity rather than vanity. A small cloth soaked in whiskey could erase the day's fatigue faster than any scented soap. Alcohol's quick evaporation left the skin feeling cool and dry. It was a false freshness, but it fooled the senses well, in hot summers, when corsets and layers turned the body into a furnace. That coolness was bliss. Some even believed it prevented illness by closing the pores before bad air could enter. Doctors of the time praised alcohol as both antiseptic and tonic. The line between health and hygiene blurred easily. If someone tried this today, it would look like using hand sanitizer as body lotion and calling it skincare. Yet in their world, it was innovation. A bottle of whiskey on the dresser served not only for celebration but for survival. The method spread quickly through word of mouth and magazine columns. Household guides recommended it for its refreshing effects, especially before bed or after travel. It was seen as modern, practical, even moral. Soap could be wasteful, but whiskey could be shared, measured, and justified. It smelled of progress and restraint at once, a symbol of British discipline dressed as indulgence. To wipe oneself with alcohol was to participate in civilization's newest logic that cleanliness required no comfort, only control. The sensation on the skin was not always pleasant. The alcohol stung open pores, aggravated small cuts, and left red blotches on sensitive areas. But pain had long been a companion to virtue. A brief burn was worth the confidence of walking into the company without shame. The cold wash made faces glow and limbs tighten. It gave people the illusion of health in bodies worn by labour and poor air. Men returning from the factory used whiskey to clean their hands and faces before supper, scrubbing away coal dust and fatigue in the same gesture. The act was both cleansing and erasing, a ritual of pretending that dirt and exhaustion had no power. Women, too, found comfort in its bite. The cloth, once soaked and wrung, became part of a morning routine that felt both private and powerful. It was not spoken of in polite conversation, but its results were visible skin that seemed smoother, cleaner, more composed. There was something quietly admirable in their willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of dignity. The smell of whiskey became associated with discipline rather than indulgence. It was a mark of effort, a scent of control. Some households mixed whiskey with vinegar or herbal water, believing the combination doubled its strength. Others used it straight, wiping quickly to avoid irritation. Recipes for spirited washes appeared in women's journals, each claiming to improve complexion or sweeten the skin. No one mentioned the dryness or itching that followed. Like most Victorian inventions, the ritual survived because it felt correct, not because it worked perfectly. Cleanliness was an appearance, not a condition. In poorer districts, the practice took on rougher forms. Men soaked rags in leftover liquor from taverns and wiped their arms, necks, and chests, laughing at the waste of good drink but grateful for its effect. The smell of alcohol clung to them, mingling with sweat and smoke, creating a scent that was neither pleasant nor foul, only human. In the alleys where disease spread easily, such measures felt heroic. A cloth, a cup of whiskey, and a few minutes of effort could create the illusion of safety in a city where danger filled the air. Whiskey's antiseptic qualities were not entirely myth. Alcohol killed some bacteria and evaporated without leaving residue, making it genuinely cleaner than most alternatives. But the Victorians took it further, trusting it as a cure for nearly everything. They drank it for courage, poured it on wounds, rubbed it into the skin to strengthen the nerves. The boundary between cleansing and healing vanished entirely. What began as hygiene became faith, a belief that something fiery could also be pure. The scent that filled their rooms after these washings was unmistakable. It lingered on clothing, in hair, on pillowcases. It was not the sweet perfume of flowers, but the sharp tang of discipline. Visitors might have noticed it but said nothing. It was as much a part of domestic life as coal smoke or candle wax. The smell announced effort, and in the Victorian world, effort was virtue. The faint sting on the skin was proof of care, of respectability preserved through discomfort. At night, when the air cooled and lamps burned low, the same ritual might be repeated. A quick wipe before bed removed the day's residue, leaving behind a ghost of warmth and fragrance. It was a comfort against the filth that seemed endless, a reminder that even in dirt there was still some control to be found. The bottle of whiskey on the washstand gleamed faintly in the light, a symbol of both indulgence and survival. The diluted whiskey left behind more than a scent. It left the memory of control in a world built on grime. It was a brief escape, sharp enough to burn yet soft enough to believe in, somewhere not far away. Another scent was rising, sweet, bitter, and deceptively pure, drawn not from alcohol but from a fruit meant to cleanse the mouth and calm the stomach. In an age when the scent of breath could define one's place in society, Victorians turned to the simplest of remedies, a bite of lemon. Fresh fruit was costly, but a single wedge of lemon, pale and sharp, promised miracles that soap or perfume could not provide. It was not eaten for pleasure. The goal was control. The acid was believed to kill the bacteria that lingered in the mouth after meals, especially when garlic, onion, or spoiled meat left their traces behind. A woman might slip a small piece of lemon peel into her mouth while clearing the table, letting the bitterness sting her tongue as it masks the smell of the food she had just served. The sourness was unpleasant, but it was proof of refinement. In a world obsessed with propriety, even pain could taste like virtue. Lemons symbolized purity. They were bright, clean, and rare. The opposite of the smoke-filled rooms and unwashed air that defined most of Victorian life. To hold one was to hold a piece of brightness against the gloom. Those who could afford them displayed bowls of lemons on their tables, as if cleanliness could be summoned through sight alone. But for those who used them practically, the lemon was medicine, not ornament. It is faintly amusing that Victorians trusted a fruit to do what soap and science could not make them feel untainted in a world covered in soot. The practice of biting lemon peel was particularly common among those who cooked or worked in markets. The strong scent of fish, onions, and meat clung to the mouth long after the meal was done. A quick bite of lemon cut through the odour, leaving a clean, burning freshness that felt almost holy. Some even rubbed the peel directly on their teeth, believing it whitened them. It did, briefly, though at the cost of enamel and pain. The Victorians had little concept of long-term harm. The immediate illusion of purity was reward enough. To imagine it in modern terms would be like watching someone brush their teeth with bleach and calling it progress. Yet the lemon had its logic. Its acidity truly did destroy some bacteria, and in a time without reliable toothpaste, that made it valuable. Mouthwash was an expensive novelty, available only to the rich, and toothbrushes were still crude, with bristles made of bone and animal hair. For the rest, lemon water served as both cleanser and deodorizer. People gargled it, sipped it, and wiped their lips with slices after meals. The tang of citrus filled parlours and kitchens alike, cutting through the heavy smell of coal and grease. The ritual was not confined to the poor. Wealthier families kept lemons for the same purpose, though with more elegance. They infused lemon peel in alcohol, creating what they called mouth elixir. It was poured into glass bottles and dabbed on the tongue with a silver spoon. Guests were offered drops after dinner, an act both polite and self-protective. In conversation, no one mentioned breath directly, but everyone understood. Clean air between people was as important as clean clothing. In a society that prized restraint, even hygiene became an act of quiet diplomacy. For those who could not afford fresh lemons, substitutes appeared. Dried peel was sold in paper packets, or vinegar was mixed with lemon oil to mimic the effect. Some used diluted lemon water daily, swishing it through their mouths each morning as if beginning the day with a cleansing ritual. It was cheap, accessible, and more importantly, it looked refined. The sour taste became associated with discipline, the mark of someone who cared about their place in the world. The breath might sting, the tongue might ache, but that discomfort was invisible, and appearances were what mattered most. The irony of this ritual was not lost even then. Newspapers printed small jokes about people who reeked of lemons but still carried the sins of onions. Still, no one stopped. Cleanliness, even imagined, was power. There is something almost tender about their determination to scrub away every trace of life smells, as if purity could be achieved one sour bite at a time. In a time when disease and decay filled every street, the sharp sting of lemon was a reminder that at least the mouth, the gateway to the body, could be kept civilized. The taste of lemon was more than hygiene, it was identity. Its brightness stood against the heaviness of the Victorian meal, against the smoke of factories and the dullness of grey skies. It offered a kind of renewal, fleeting but sincere. The same acidity that burned the tongue also awakened the mind. A woman chewing lemon peel might wince at the bitterness, but she would breathe easier afterward, convinced she carried a cleaner version of herself into the world. This sourness became a habit, and habit became culture. Physicians endorsed the practice, praising lemon's invigorating effect on the body. They wrote of its ability to sweeten the breath and strengthen the gums, repeating words that sounded like scripture more than science. Housewives copied these claims into their diaries, passing them down to daughters as advice. The line between care and ritual disappeared entirely. Lemon became both healer and symbol, a tiny, fragrant rebellion against filth. Even children learned to chew the rind after meals, grimacing at its taste. For them, it was less about health and more about imitation. Cleanliness began early in the Victorian home, not as comfort but as obedience. A well-behaved child endured sourness without complaint, learning that to be proper was to be controlled. The family dinner ended not with sweetness but with sharpness, a bite of bitterness swallowed for respectability's sake. The image of entire families biting lemons at the end of supper may seem comical now, yet it captured the spirit of their age perfectly. Cleanliness was not joy. It was endurance. They chased purity through discomfort, as if moral virtue could be measured in the wince it required. Lemon's purity was temporary, its scent fleeting, but its promise endured. For a few brief moments, mouths that had tasted smoke and rot could taste something clean. The faint scent of citrus lingered after the act, carried on the air like proof of effort. It mixed with the aroma of candles and coal, cutting through the heaviness of home. Each bite was a small victory over decay, a flash of brightness swallowed in silence. The peel hardened between the teeth, and then it was gone, leaving only the memory of sharpness and the illusion of purity restored. Lemon's sting was a fleeting kind of holiness, a promise that decay could be delayed through will alone. It burned the mouth, cleared the air, and reminded people that they were still alive beneath all the dust, somewhere beyond those walls. Another ritual was waiting, one that replaced sourness with softness, using something as ordinary as grain to make the hair appear clean without a single drop of water. Victorian hair was an elaborate contradiction, polished in public but rarely clean in truth. Water was mistrusted, especially for washing the head, where it was believed to cause chills, headaches, and even madness. Soap left residue, and scented oils attracted dust. In the absence of better options, people turned to their kitchens, and from there came a quiet solution that looked like luxury but was born of desperation. Ground oats, pale and soft, were sprinkled through the hair to absorb oil and dirt. The powder left a faint sheen, lifted the roots, and gave the illusion of freshness. What the Victorians called cleanliness was, more often than not, a performance built from clever disguises. The process required patience. Women sat before mirrors, shoulders wrapped in towels, while maids sifted oatmeal powder through fine hair like snow. The grains clung to grease and soot, soaking up everything water could not reach. After a few minutes, the powder was brushed away, taking with it the residue of city life. Hair that had been heavy now looked airy, faintly perfumed if lavender or lemon peel had been mixed in. It is almost comical that they use breakfast food to mimic the effect of bathing, but in that strange way, it worked. The scalp felt lighter, the hair softer, and the faint dust that remained on collars was a small price for appearing civilized. Oatmeal's appeal was its gentleness. Unlike vinegar or alcohol, it caused no sting, no dryness, no pain. The Victorians, so used to discomfort in their cleanliness rituals, found in oats a rare kindness. Some claimed the powder strengthened hair and prevented baldness. Others swore it kept lice away. Its real gift was illusion. From a distance, powdered hair caught the light beautifully. It looked clean even when it was not, and that was all that mattered. To imagine it today would be like using flour instead of shampoo and calling it innovation. Yet their logic was not without reason. Oats absorbed oil, and oil was the enemy of decency. In a world where bathing might happen once a week or less, dry powders offered freedom from both filth and judgment. A well-dusted head suggested discipline, while an oily one hinted at carelessness. Cleanliness, in the Victorian sense, was not purity of body but obedience to expectation. Men used it too, rubbing coarse oatmeal into their hair before brushing it out with stiff combs. Barbers sold mixtures of oats and powdered rice under names like dry wash or gentleman's refinement. For women, it was another hidden step in the endless choreography of preparation. They applied the powder before arranging their curls, making sure no sheen of sweat betrayed the truth beneath. The soft, grainy texture gave volume to limp hair, turning necessity into fashion. It was one of the few beauty rituals shared across class lines, practiced by housemaids and duchesses alike. The smell of oats mingled with perfume and dust, faint but familiar. In bedrooms lined with fabric and furniture that trapped every scent, even a whisper of freshness felt luxurious. Servants collected old oats, ground them by hand, and stored the powder in tins or paper cones. It spilled easily, coating mirrors and tabletops, yet no one complained. The mess meant progress. A fine layer of powder on the floor was proof that someone cared about appearance. Beneath the soft glamour, though, was a certain sadness, a quiet admission that water, the simplest form of cleanliness, had become a danger too great to risk. The habit spread through magazines and household guides. Writers praised oatmeal's ability to revive the hair without harm, promising results that sounded miraculous. Women compared mixtures, adding herbs or powdered chalk for colour, or starch for extra lift. The act became social, a point of conversation hidden under politeness. They spoke of recipes rather than results, careful never to mention the real purpose. Clean hair was a sign of control, and control was the one luxury everyone could afford to fake. Children learned early that hair should never appear oily. Mothers brushed their daughters' curls at night, sprinkling powder as they whispered warnings about appearance and respectability. The powder made the hair shimmer faintly, like frost in lamplight. It was pretty, yes, but also practical. Dust hid dust. To look clean was to be forgiven for being dirty. The line between truth and illusion vanished beneath every sweep of the brush. There is something quietly touching in their faith that beauty could be manufactured from grain and patience. The sound of brushing, rhythmic and slow, filled small rooms as women prepared for bed. Each stroke released a soft cloud of powder, falling like snow on their shoulders. It smelled faintly of warmth and work, of mornings and kitchens, but they found comfort in it. The same hands that baked bread and stirred porridge could also create refinement. Cleanliness, they discovered, could be crafted from what was meant to feed them. Not everyone approved. Some doctors warned that the powder clogged pores and weakened the scalp, but the warnings were easy to ignore. The ritual worked well enough, and habits that brought dignity were hard to abandon. Even reformers who preached about bathing admitted that dry washing had its place in crowded cities with little clean water. For them, a handful of oats was better than nothing, a fragile barrier between the human body and the filth of industry. In wealthy homes, the ritual became refined to performance. Powder jars made of glass or porcelain sat beside combs and pins. The dusting was done in silence, with slow precision, as if performing a sacred task. The result was always the same, a head of hair that looked untouched by hardship. But beneath the powder lay the truth of Victorian life, one where everything appeared graceful from afar and stiflingly uncomfortable up close. By the time night came, the illusion had settled. Hair framed the face in perfect order, soft but lifeless, each strand clinging faintly to the smell of oats. No one spoke of the residue on pillows, the itch of fine dust at the nape of the neck. Cleanliness had been achieved, at least in sight and scent, and that was enough to sleep in peace. The powder left the scalp cool and dry, the mind convinced of purity if only for a moment. It turned daily neglect into ceremony, and ceremony into comfort. In another part of the same home, a quieter ritual unfolded, one that involved no powder or grain at all, only the gentle scent of citrus drifting from drawers lined with dried fruit peels. The air inside a Victorian wardrobe was rarely still. Beneath layers of wool, silk, and linen, the smell of dampness waited patiently, growing stronger with every passing day. The houses were cold, the walls often wet with condensation, and no amount of washing could stop mould from creeping into the fabric. It was an invisible enemy that turned fine gowns into musty rags. To fight it, women turned to one of the simplest defences imaginable, the peel of an orange. Dried until brittle and pale, it was placed carefully between folded garments, tucked into pockets, or hung from small cloth sachets. The scent was faint but persistent, a trace of sunlight trapped in a world of coal and dust. For those who lived surrounded by smoke and soot, the smell of citrus was a small reminder that freshness still existed somewhere. The practice came naturally, long before perfume sachets or chemical moth repellents. Oranges were symbols of health and vitality, precious gifts that carried the memory of warmth from distant places. After the fruit was eaten, nothing was wasted. The peel was sliced thin, left to dry near the hearth, and saved. Once hardened, it was ready for its new purpose to protect clothes from decay and to hide the scent of neglect. It is oddly charming that the Victorians trusted the leftovers of their breakfast more than any manufactured cleaner. Yet for them, the orange peel held real power. Its oil repelled insects and masked the mildew that rose from damp floors. The scent was clean, sharp, and moral, the opposite of the rot it concealed. Inside every wardrobe, the story repeated itself. Dresses, shawls, and undergarments were folded neatly with bits of citrus hidden like secret guardians between the folds. When the door was opened, the air that escaped carried a hint of sweetness. Not enough to overwhelm, but enough to reassure. Visitors sometimes noticed and smiled politely. A fragrant wardrobe suggested order, and order was proof of virtue. A musty one suggested carelessness, or worse, poverty. In a society that valued appearance over comfort, even the smell of one's clothes spoke of moral worth. To compare it with modern habits, it would be like placing orange-scented candles in a closet and calling it hygiene. Still, the logic was practical. Mold and moths thrived in damp cloth, and citrus oils genuinely discouraged them. The Victorians understood little about microbes, but they understood survival. They had learned that clean scents were safer than no scents at all. The perfume of the orange peel might not cleanse the air, but it created the illusion of cleanliness, and illusion was often enough to sleep peacefully at night. The sight of orange peels drying on kitchen shelves became a common one. Housewives arranged them on plates or strung them by thread to catch the weak sunlight through the window. When visitors asked, they would explain that it was for the clothes, but in truth, it was also for the mind. The smell of citrus filled the house with something that felt new, something alive. Even in the coldest months, when the outside world smelled of smoke and wet earth, the faint tang of orange promised a trace of summer. Servants took scraps of peel home from their employers' tables, carrying them like treasures. In poorer districts, those fragments of fruit became tokens of gentility. A woman might hang a small bag of dried orange near her bed and believe her room smelled like wealth. Respectability was measured not in silk or silver, but in scent. The cleaner the air around you, the more civilized you appeared to be. In this way, even the discarded rind of a fruit became a tool of class and comfort. The tradition evolved quietly. Some households mixed orange peel with lavender or cloves, creating blends to suit the season. Others used lemon peel instead, brighter and sharper in smell. No one spoke of science. The proof was in the air. A house that smelled pleasant was a house under control. There was something quietly admirable in their determination to create beauty from decay, to turn waste into grace. It revealed a truth about their time, that cleanliness was not only about the body, but about the spaces that surrounded it, about the invisible atmosphere of virtue that clung to every wall and fabric. Fashionable magazines began to mention fragrant closets as signs of refined domestic management. Women compared mixtures, exchanging recipes like family secrets. Some sewed tiny sachets embroidered with initials and filled them with orange peel and herbs, both decoration and deodorizer. To open such a wardrobe was to open a small world of order, carefully arranged dresses, faint light through a crack of the door, and the steady scent of citrus holding back the damp. It was quiet, private work, but deeply personal, as if each drawer and shelf held not just clothing but character. Even as the habit spread, it remained humble. The scent of oranges never pretended to be luxury. It was too familiar, too common. It carried no vanity, only warmth. It reminded people that cleanliness could come from the simplest acts: drying, folding, tending, and caring. The fragrance, however faint, spoke of attention, and attention was a kind of love. A well-tended wardrobe meant someone had taken the time to protect what they owned, even if it was little. Over time, the practice became tradition. Every few weeks, the old peels were replaced with new ones. The gesture was small but rhythmic, a domestic ritual that marked the passing of months. The old pieces, brittle and colourless, were thrown into the fire, releasing one last puff of sweetness before vanishing into smoke. The new ones took their place, promising another few weeks of calm. In this endless cycle of replacement, cleanliness became not a task but a rhythm of life. The scent of dried orange peel clung faintly to every piece of clothing, from fine gowns to work aprons. It was a silent reassurance, a perfume of decency rather than luxury. Even those who had little could smell respectable, and that respectability meant survival in a judgmental world. The orange peel did not change lives, but it softened them. It turned small acts into symbols of care and hope in a time when both were scarce. The dried peels rested quietly in drawers and corners, their colour faded but their purpose intact. They spoke of a yearning for warmth in a cold age, of the simple wish to keep something alive amid dust and damp. Their fragrance, fragile and brief, lingered just long enough to remind people that cleanliness could be as much about memory as it was about scent. And somewhere nearby, another domestic ritual waited, one that replaced fruit and fragrance with something stranger, a beauty treatment made from eggs, promising hair as soft as silk and as glossy as glass. In the quiet of a Victorian morning, before the house filled with footsteps and smoke, a woman might sit beside her washstand with a small bowl of beaten eggs. The mixture looked strange, yellow, thick, and faintly glistening, but to her it was a secret formula, passed down in whispers between sisters and maids. There was no bottle of shampoo, no perfumed soap, only eggs, cracked carefully, the yolk separated and stirred until smooth. It was believed that the richness of the yolk could soften hair, feed it, and make it shine. The logic was simple. If eggs built life, surely they could restore beauty. And so, with slow hands, she poured the mixture over her scalp, spreading it through her hair with the patience of ritual. The faint smell of raw egg filled the air, sharp and familiar, mingling with the scent of damp fabric and coal dust drifting from the fireplace. The act was messy but sincere. Victorian women were used to discomfort in the name of cleanliness. They believed that soap stripped hair of its vitality, leaving it brittle and dull, while egg yolk, being natural, would not harm it. It is almost amusing that they turned breakfast into a beauty treatment, beating their vanity with the same utensils used to cook their meals. Yet there was method in the madness. The yolk contained oils that coated each strand, giving it the illusion of health long after the hair had dried. When rinsed with lemon water or vinegar, the smell faded, replaced by a faint brightness that felt like virtue. The process took time, and time was a luxury. Those who could afford servants had their maids perform the task for them, brushing the mixture through their hair with care and washing it out over basins lined with linen. The poor did it themselves, bending over small bowls of water, patient and persistent. The result was rarely perfect. The water was cold, the rinsing incomplete, and sometimes the eggs cooked slightly against warm skin, leaving traces that had to be combed away. Still, the outcome felt miraculous compared to soap. The hair shone, soft and heavy, carrying a scent that was more natural than perfumed. If someone did this today, it would look like a strange experiment from a kitchen rather than a bathroom. But in Victorian times, there was dignity and simplicity. Everything natural was considered virtuous, and the closer one stayed to nature, the purer one appeared. The world was changing fast. Machines, smoke, and science crowded the streets, but inside the home, nature still reigned as the trusted healer. The egg, so ordinary, became a symbol of renewal. It transformed dirt into softness, fatigue into radiance. For women who rarely washed their hair, the treatment was an event. It was done perhaps once a week, or even less, depending on the weather and water supply. On those days, rooms filled with the strange sweetness of egg and vinegar. Hair was divided into sections, carefully coated, then left to rest while other chores were done. Some wrapped their heads in towels, believing warmth helped the mixture sink deeper. Others brushed the yolk through with combs carved from bone or wood, watching the dull strands glisten back to life. Servants often joined in these rituals, sharing what little remained in the bowl once their mistress was done. In narrow servants' quarters, women sat side by side, laughing quietly as they rinsed the yolk from their hair. For a brief moment, even the poorest could feel refined. Clean hair was not a luxury of wealth, but of care, and care was something they could still afford to give themselves. The sound of rinsing filled the house, water splashing into porcelain basins. Lemon juice or vinegar followed, poured in small amounts to cut through the oil. The sting on the scalp was sharp but satisfying. They said it closed the pores, sealed in the shine, and gave hair a scent of cleanliness that would last until the next washing. The reality was less perfect. but they believed it worked, and belief was often more powerful than truth. There is something strangely beautiful about their willingness to endure inconvenience for a feeling of grace, as though cleanliness itself were a kind of faith. Hair dried slowly, sometimes overnight, wrapped in cloth to protect it from soot and dust. In the morning, it fell smooth and heavy down their backs, catching light like silk. For a few hours, they felt elegant, untouched by the dirt of the city. The yoke had done its part. The illusion of purity had been restored. Some even claimed it cured headaches, that the act of massaging the scalp strengthened the nerves. The human need to turn comfort into meaning was endless. Recipes for egg washes appeared in women's magazines alongside advice for moral conduct and household management. They recommended mixing yolk with rum for shine, or with honey for softness. The instructions read more like sermons than science, reminding readers that beauty was the result of discipline and modesty. To care for one's hair was to honour one's position, to reflect virtue outward. Clean hair meant moral order. Disorder, by contrast, was a sin that began at the scalp and spread downward. The practice, like most Victorian habits, blurred the line between care and punishment. The smell of eggs lingered even after rinsing, sometimes sweet, sometimes sour, depending on the mixture. Yet no one complained. The faint odour was proof of effort. To smell of anything other than soap or decay was an achievement in itself. The Victorians lived surrounded by contradictions, progress and filth, elegance and exhaustion. The egg wash, humble as it was, held them together, a symbol of control in a life that offered so little of it. The hair that dried after such care shone with deceptive health. Each strand was coated with residue that glimmered under candlelight, as though the body itself had learned to shine. It was an illusion, but illusions were precious. They made survival beautiful. The eggs, broken and beaten, had given shape to something fragile and proud. The idea that one could rise clean from a world built on dirt. Faint traces of egg and lemon clung to the air, lingering like the ghost of purity in rooms that would soon return to dust and smoke. Cleanliness, no matter how brief, had once again been crafted by hand and faith. Nearby waited another secret, one made not of food or oil, but of flowers ground to powder and scattered beneath beds to turn sleep itself into a ritual of fragrance. Nighttime in a Victorian bedroom was not the peaceful image often painted by history. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of sweat, smoke, and old fabric. Windows were rarely opened, and mattresses, stuffed with straw or horsehair, trapped every odour of the body. Few homes had the means or the time to wash bedding often, so cleanliness had to be improvised. The answer was both delicate and strange, powdered dried flowers, sprinkled under the mattress and between sheets. The mixture was meant to absorb moisture and mask unpleasant smells, turning the bed into a quiet garden of fading scent. For women who spent their days managing the invisible labour of cleanliness, this trick felt almost like magic. They ground lavender, rose petals, and violet blossoms into fine powder, often mixed with crushed herbs like sage or mint. The result was pale and fragrant, easily scattered by hand. It gave the bed a softness that suggested care, even when the sheets had not been washed in weeks. As the body lay down, the faint warmth released the fragrance again, sweet and sleepy. It is strangely endearing that the Victorians solved the problem of sweat by sleeping on crushed flowers, as if nature herself could forgive their neglect. Yet for them, this small ritual carried comfort. It allowed them to rest surrounded by the illusion of purity, even when the air was thick with the smell of oil lamps and damp wood. In the warm months, the powder became a necessity. Humidity turned beds into breeding grounds for mould and mites. The floral dust worked like a silent shield, drawing moisture from the fabric and keeping it cool. Some even believed it calmed the nerves, that the fragrance of lavender and rose soothed troubled sleep. There was science in that belief, though they didn't know it. Certain oils did have calming effects, though their understanding came from instinct, not medicine. To them, cleanliness was not a chemical state, but a feeling, a softness of air, a sweetness that told them they had done enough. If someone tried this today, it would seem more like a romantic ritual than hygiene. But in Victorian homes, where the smell of human life clung to every surface, these powders were survival. They were made in kitchens, mixed with spoons once used for tea, and stored in glass jars near the fire. Every week or two, women changed the mixture, shaking out the old and scattering the new. The discarded powder was tossed into the garden, where it returned quietly to the earth. In this rhythm, cleaning became cyclical, almost poetic, a conversation between decay and renewal. The bed itself was often a contradiction. Covered in fine lace and embroidery by day, it turned into a warm, humid trap by night. Mattresses were rarely replaced, and sometimes used for decades. Inside, the straw darkened, compacted, and began to rot. But outwardly, it appeared perfect. That was enough. The Victorians valued appearances so deeply that even scent became part of performance. A bed that smelled faintly of roses implied virtue. One that smelled of sweat betrayed disorder. There was a moral weight to fragrance, a belief that pleasant smells meant purity of both body and soul. Servants prepared the powders for their employers, sifting flowers and herbs through muslin to achieve a fine texture. The work was messy, but the results were pleasing. For the servants themselves, cheaper materials had to do: dried hay, flowers, chamomile, or even sawdust soaked in vinegar. Yet the comfort it brought was the same. Clean scent blurred the line between poverty and gentility, between exhaustion and dignity. It was not wealth that smelled good, but care. The ritual of changing the bed became almost sacred. Women lifted the corners of mattresses with steady hands, their faces calm and methodical. Each handful of powder represented attention, a quiet defiance against the filth that always seemed to creep back. The smell filled the air for only a short while, fading into something faintly earthy. But in those hours, the room felt lighter. Even the act of lying down became a statement of control, a rare moment where their environment bent, however slightly, to their will. Magazines praised this method as a sign of refinement. Advice columns described the perfect blend of flowers, suggesting that women should adjust their mixtures to match the season. Rose and violet for spring, lavender and sage for summer, cedar and myrrh for winter. It was a way of dressing the room, not just the body. To maintain a fragrant bed was to prove one's worth as a homemaker, even when no one but the sleeper would notice. The unseen effort mattered most, for it was virtue performed in silence. Sometimes, when money was scarce, people turned to the simplest ingredients: hay dust, tea leaves, or dried herbs stolen from kitchens. These humble versions lacked the sweetness of roses but carried their own quiet charm. Even the faintest scent could make a difference. A single note of lavender drifting through the darkness could make a room feel less like confinement and more like care. The Victorians understood this deeply. Cleanliness, to them, was not the absence of dirt. It was the presence of effort. There is something deeply human in their need to turn even sleep into a ritual of order and grace. They did not rest because their world allowed it. They rested because they created the illusion of peace around themselves. The powder under the bed was a promise to wake up feeling lighter, to believe, if only briefly, that the air they breathed was pure. The morning would break, the scent would fade, and the struggle with filth would begin again. But for one night, surrounded by the ghost of flowers, they could dream of something gentler. The fragrance of the dried petals would linger faintly until dawn, blending with the warmth of sleep. It was not real cleanliness, but it felt like it, and that was enough to bring rest in a restless age. Nearby, another domestic trick waited in the dim light, a ritual born not from flowers or perfume, but from dust and earth, where the clean came not from scent, but from the strange roughness of sand used to cleanse the hands. In the dust and smoke of Victorian streets, clean hands were a privilege few could maintain. Water was not always available, and when it was often too cold, too dirty, or too far from reach. Soap remained expensive for the poor and harsh for the delicate, leaving many to search for other ways to scrub away the grime of daily life. From this need came an unlikely invention, one not sold in bottles or bars, but gathered from the ground itself. Dry sand or fine clay became the travelling companion of cleanliness, poured into small pouches and carried discreetly in pockets or baskets. When rubbed between the palms, the grains lifted oil and dirt, polishing the skin with a rough kindness that water alone could not match. It was a method both primitive and practical, one that connected refinement to the most basic element of earth. The Victorians were proud of progress, yet their hygiene often leaned on ancient wisdom. Sand cleaned not through scent or lather, but through texture, through friction. It is oddly fascinating that a society obsessed with refinement returned to the ground to feel pure again. The act was quick: a handful of sand, a few firm rubs, and the dirt loosened, gathering into a dull residue that could be brushed away. It left the skin dry, not smooth, but satisfyingly clean. For those who spent their days working outdoors, it was a secret trick, something learned from travellers, farmers, or soldiers, adapted for the quiet routines of Victorian respectability. Clay served the same purpose, though it was softer, cooler, and preferred by those with paler skin. Women often kept small jars of powdered clay in their vanity drawers, labelled simply as earth. A pinch was enough. When rubbed into the skin, it absorbed oil and left the hands matte and pale, considered a sign of refinement. Some added drops of lavender or rose water to make the ritual gentler, though the core remained the same cleanliness achieved through dust. To imagine it today would be like polishing your skin with soil and calling it luxury. Yet for the Victorians, it worked. The hands felt lighter, the nails clearer, the shame of dirt momentarily erased. The fascination with purity ran deep. Dirt was not just physical, it carried moral weight. Clean hands meant discipline, respectability, and control. In a world where appearances defined worth, every gesture mattered. To offer a handshake or touch one's face required confidence that the skin beneath the glove was not stained. For the working poor, whose lives revolved around labour and soot, sand became a bridge between survival and dignity. A few minutes of rubbing could make a coal worker's hands look almost gentle again, enough to feel human in a society that measured humanity by the absence of grime. Travellers and soldiers relied on the same method. Long journeys without access to water turned sand into a kind of portable soap. It scrubbed away sweat, food, and dust with surprising effectiveness. It could even clean under the nails, that small but telling detail of personal care. Manuals on domestic management quietly recommended the method as an expedient for situations without water. In the same pages that spoke of rose-scented towels and silver basins, there lay this humble advice, proof that even the most elegant lives still relied on earth. Women used it discreetly, especially when travelling by carriage. They carried tiny cloth bags filled with fine sand, hidden among lace and handkerchiefs. After long journeys, they would step aside, dust their hands, and shake the residue out the window. The motion was graceful, almost elegant, though its origin was necessity. The gesture became a habit, and the habit became a culture. Even in the drawing rooms of polished society, a faint layer of sand sometimes clung to the seams of gloves, unnoticed evidence of the struggle between vanity and survival. The use of clay went further, touching beauty as much as cleanliness. Some women mixed clay with water to form a soft paste for the face and neck, believing it drew out impurities. The same material used to cleanse the hands became a mark of refinement when packaged in glass jars and sold under foreign names. There is something quietly ironic in how the Victorians could turn dirt into a symbol of purity simply by renaming it. In the right container, even the earth could be elegant. The poor, however, did not need names or packaging. They simply reached for what they had. Street vendors sometimes offered small bags of sand at markets, sold for pennies beside soap and vinegar. It was the cleanliness of the desperate, cheap, immediate, and oddly effective. After work, men would gather by the river, not to wash, but to rub their hands raw with sand. The gesture was repetitive and silent, as though trying to scrub away not just dirt but fatigue itself. The skin cracked, but the feeling of rough dryness was preferable to the sticky grip of oil and soot. To be clean, even briefly, was worth the sting. In wealthier homes, the same practice was refined into gentility. Clay was perfumed and coloured, wrapped in silk, and stored beside powders for the face. The difference was not in the method, but in the presentation. Both rich and poor rubbed the same earth into their hands, only the scent changed, and with it, the illusion of superiority. Cleanliness, once again, became a language of class disguised as hygiene. Doctors occasionally warned that the abrasiveness of sand could damage the skin, but few listened. It worked quickly, and in a life where time was measured by labour, quickness mattered more than gentleness. The Victorians accepted small harm in exchange for the feeling of control. The roughness of the sand mirrored their world, harsh, efficient, and proud of endurance. The grit between their fingers became a reminder of resilience, a physical echo of the discipline their society demanded. The method endured because it spoke to something deeper than convenience. It offered proof that even without water, one could still maintain composure, that cleanliness was not a privilege but a choice. It was an act of defiance against filth and circumstance, a declaration that refinement could grow from the ground itself. When the hands were finally brushed clean and the sand scattered, there lingered a strange satisfaction, a quiet triumph over decay. Grains of sand slipped through fingers, falling to the ground from which they came. Clean hands rested lightly in the dim candlelight, rough but steady, marked by the effort it took to stay that way. Beyond the washstand, another trick waited, one that used not earth, but the gentlest mist of dawn itself to cleanse what could not be washed by hand. Before the city stirred, while the streets still slept beneath a silver fog, Victorian women performed one of the quietest rituals of cleanliness their age had known. Between 4 and 5 in the morning, long before servants began their daily duties, corsets were carried outside and hung upon garden rails, where the pale mist of dawn waited to receive them. There was no sound but the distant call of a milk cart and the soft rustle of fabric as it caught the air. The dew clung to the cloth, dampening it just enough to draw out the odours of sweat and skin that had built up through the day's suffocation. The corset, that unforgiving cage of bone and fabric, was left to breathe in the gentlest washwater nature could provide. Dew. The belief was both simple and strange. Dew, they thought, possessed a purifying power. It absorbed the body's scent, softened the fabric stiffened by heat and pressure, and left behind a cool freshness that soap and water could not match. Washing a corset was nearly impossible anyway. Its whalebone structure, stiff seams, and delicate stitching would warp or snap under wet weight. So the early morning air became the only laundress gentle enough for such garments. It is almost poetic that something as cruel as a corset found its only comfort in the softness of dawn. Women who had spent their days gasping for breath beneath its grip trusted the night air to heal what the day had broken. The scene was quietly haunting rows of pale garments swaying like ghosts among the hedges, catching the faint light before sunrise. Servants tended to them in silence, their breath visible in the chill. They would lift each corset carefully, mindful not to disturb the fine stitching, and lay them across lines or fences. The mist did the rest. Within an hour, the fabric felt lighter, cleaner and faintly cool to the touch. To the Victorians, this was not superstition, it was domestic wisdom, born from necessity. Soap was reserved for linens and undergarments. The corset was too costly, too complex. Dew was the invisible luxury that everyone could afford. To compare it with modern habits, it would be like airing silk lingerie in the mist instead of washing it, an act that feels both impractical and strangely beautiful. Yet for them, it made perfect sense. Water in Victorian homes was often harsh, filled with minerals that yellowed fabric and destroyed stitching. Dew, by contrast, was gentle, leaving no mark, no stain. It restored softness without risk. The ritual was passed down between women, unspoken yet universal when the world is asleep. Let your corset drink the dawn. The smell of the morning garden mingled with fabric, the faint sweetness of grass, the cool metallic scent of wet iron, the distant smoke from chimneys not yet lit. When the garments were brought back inside, they carried this mixture with them, a natural perfume of freshness and effort. It clung to the body through the day, softening the sharp odour of confinement. To the nose of a stranger, it might have smelled of virtue, of restraint disguised as cleanliness. The corset itself was a paradox, both armour and prison. It shaped posture, controlled movement, and dictated breath. By night, the marks it left on skin were deep and red, grooves of discipline. Dew did not erase them, but it symbolized relief, a moment when the garment no longer dictated life, when it simply hung there, silent and obedient. Some women said the morning air gave their corsets new life. Others saw it as a quiet ritual of apology, a way to cleanse both fabric and conscience. Servants often performed this duty in secret, long before their employers awoke. They would walk barefoot across damp grass, corsets draped over their arms like sleeping creatures. The air was cold enough to sting, but they moved quickly, practiced. Some whispered that this early hour belonged to them alone, a rare peace between the end of night and the beginning of labour. Watching the mist swallow the corsets, they might have felt something close to calm. Cleanliness was not just about scrubbing or scent, it was about balance, a fleeting moment where order returned to the world. Even men noticed the practice. Passing early through gardens or courtyards, they sometimes glimpsed these pale shapes and mistook them for shrouds. The image stayed with them, a reminder that even beauty required small acts of mourning. The corset, after all, carried the daily cost of grace. It held the body upright, but also trapped it. It gave the illusion of strength while quietly bruising the flesh beneath. And in those quiet hours before sunrise, the dew did what mercy could not. It gave back softness to what had been hardened by duty. There is something deeply human in how they used the natural world to repair what their society had broken. The dew became a healer, a silent partner in endurance. It asked for no effort, no money, only time and trust. In return, it offered freshness that no soap could match. This unspoken understanding between the body, the garment, and the earth revealed how fragile their pursuit of purity truly was. Even the most refined lives depended on nature's smallest gifts. By the time the sun rose, the corsets were dry again, the dew having vanished as if it had never been there. The air warmed, footsteps filled the house, and the garments returned to their places, ready once more to tighten, to reshape, to discipline. The moment of softness had passed, replaced by the daily ritual of restraint. Yet for a few quiet minutes, those women had known something like freedom, even if they would never call it that. Faint traces of grass and mist lingered in the seams, reminders of the dawn's brief mercy. Cleanliness, once again, had been achieved through patience and illusion. Somewhere nearby, another ritual awaited, one not of cloth and dew, but of flesh and preparation, when the body itself was readied for ceremonies too sacred to begin unwashed. Morning light in a Victorian dressing room fell softly through lace curtains, glinting on mirrors and combs laid neatly on a polished wooden table. Amid the powders, perfumes, and brushes stood a small bottle of orange oil, pale and translucent, with a scent that carried both warmth and sharpness. It was not merely for beauty, but for survival. The city air outside was heavy with coal smoke and hair, unwashed for days or even weeks, absorbed every trace of it. To walk through the streets was to wear the scent of soot and sweat. But a few drops of oil, brushed through the hair with a wooden comb, could mask the truth. The smell of orange meant freshness, even when the air was foul. It was a fragrance that spoke of care, a signal of refinement amid decay. The ritual was slow, deliberate, and intimate. A woman would warm the oil between her palms, letting it catch the light before touching her hair. Then, with a wooden comb, she drew it through from root to tip, each stroke steady, rhythmic, quiet. The wooden teeth spread the oil evenly, taming static and smoothing stray strands that had caught the city's dust. Unlike metal combs, which pulled and sparked in dry air, wood worked gently, aligning the hair without breakage. The oil gave it weight and shine, softening the stiffness left by powders and wind. It is almost comical to imagine women battling coal dust with orange oil, but it was their most elegant form of defiance. The scent of orange clung to them as they moved through the day, faint but persistent. In drawing rooms, on trams, and at markets, it lingered just enough to suggest that they were untouched by the world around them. That illusion was worth more than comfort. It was identity. To smell of fruit and light was to separate oneself from the grime of the streets, to remind others that gentility could still exist within the shadow of smoke. It was, in a way, the Victorian version of spritzing perfume before stepping into polluted air, a small, fragrant armour against the chaos of the city. Orange oil also served a practical purpose. It kept the scalp from drying, reduced dandruff, and prevented hair from clinging to the face in humid weather. The Victorians, who distrusted frequent washing, saw it as both hygiene and indulgence. A clean scent equalled a clean conscience. A polished head of hair suggested moral order. The brightness of the oil became a metaphor for control, the idea that a woman's virtue began with the discipline of her appearance. For the poor, orange oil was replaced by cheaper alternatives, drops of vinegar or animal fat scented with peel. But the effect was the same. The wooden comb, humble and timeless, was the great equalizer. It asked for no power, no luxury, only patience. Each stroke through tangled hair became a kind of meditation, a brief pause in a world that demanded constant restraint. Servants brushed their mistress's hair in silence, counting strokes as though reciting a prayer. The soft sound of wood gliding through hair filled the room, steady as a clock, marking time through repetition. The scent of citrus brought a hint of the outdoors into closed spaces. It reminded people of warmer air, cleaner skies, and open gardens they rarely saw. The Victorians loved control, yet they longed for nature, and orange oil offered both. It was nature captured in a bottle, obedient to human hands. A few drops could make a city room smell like summer. When the brushwork was finished, the woman's hair would gleam with a subdued brightness, catching candlelight like spun gold. Her reflection in the mirror seemed calm, composed, unbothered by the soot that darkened the world beyond the window. Some claimed the oil had medicinal powers, that its scent calmed the nerves and lifted the mood. Whether true or not, the act of brushing was itself a kind of therapy. The repetition soothed restless thoughts, turning vanity into stillness. There was something deeply human in their belief that grace could be manufactured with patience and oil. It was not just about beauty, it was about order, about proving that the body could remain pure even in a city that no longer was. Children watched their mothers and learned. Little girls were taught to sit still, to lower their heads, and to let the brush glide without complaint. The smell of orange became part of memory, the scent of gentleness and control intertwined. For men, too. The oil had its place. Barbers used it to soften beards, claiming it sharpened the senses. The faint fragrance became the quiet mark of someone respectable, someone who maintained dignity through small, invisible acts. Wooden combs were often carved by hand, their surfaces polished smooth from years of use. Unlike metal, they carried warmth, and in their simplicity lay a kind of comfort. Some women had their initials carved into the handles, a small claim to ownership in lives where much belonged to others. A comb was personal, intimate, touched daily, but rarely seen. It was a quiet extension of the self, an object that connected the hands, the senses, and the soul in one fluid motion. The act of brushing continued even after dusk, when candles burned low and the house fell silent. Women sat before mirrors in their nightgowns, running the comb through their hair until the shine returned, until the day's dirt and sorrow were brushed away. The oil gleamed faintly in the candlelight, making the air shimmer with citrus warmth. When the comb was finally set down, it carried traces of the day-stray hairs, faint oil, and the ghost of exhaustion transformed into calm. Outside, the night pressed close, thick with soot and silence. Inside, the faint glow of orange oil lingered in the air, a promise that even in a world of filth, beauty could still exist through care. Each stroke had restored not just the hair, but the quiet belief that order could still be found in the smallest rituals. Soft scent, soft shine, soft peace. The city could stain everything it touched, but not the persistence of those who refused to surrender to it. Waiting nearby was another quiet ritual, one that smelled not of fruit or flowers, but of ferment and forgotten bottles, where even the waste of wine found a second life in the pursuit of cleanliness. In a time when medicine was primitive and hygiene still half superstition, the Victorians turned to whatever the pantry could provide. Among glass bottles and corked jars, one stood apart, a half-used bottle of wine, sweet and faintly sour, waiting not for a dinner table but for the washstand. Water was unreliable, soap too harsh, and breath, after hours spent in coal smoke and crowded rooms, carried the stale scent of the city. Yet a few sips of diluted wine, swirled and spat discreetly, promised a form of purity that felt both modern and ancient. It cleaned without burning, perfumed without artifice. The ritual was simple: pour a small amount of cheap red wine, mix it with water, and use it as a mouth rinse. The result was soft, sweet, and quietly luxurious. The practice began among those who could not afford imported tonics or scented waters. Wine was cheap, easy to find, and already seen as cleansing. After all, it came from grapes, the fruit of nature, and nature could not harm. Over time, it spread upward, whispered in ladies' journals and household guides as a refined alternative to harsher methods. It is almost amusing that Victorians washed their mouths with what others drank to forget their worries. Yet in this contradiction lay a peculiar logic. Alcohol, they reasoned, killed germs, sugar pleased the palate, and the fragrance of grapes masked the odours of decay. For a society obsessed with appearances, such a remedy seemed perfect, both civilized and sensuous. Morning and evening, women would stand before their mirrors, holding small glass cups filled with diluted wine. The colour, like faded velvet, glowed in the lamplight. They swirled it gently, sometimes humming to themselves, the act neither medicinal nor indulgent but somewhere in between. The sweetness coated the tongue, leaving behind a faint warmth that lingered longer than water ever could. Some added a few drops of vinegar to sharpen the taste, others infused it with mint leaves or rose petals. The variations became personal, each mixture an expression of habit and vanity. To imagine it today would be like turning a glass of cheap wine into mouthwash and calling it wellness. Yet for the Victorians, it made perfect sense. Hygiene was not just about cleanliness, it was about restraint. Using wine for purity rather than pleasure, reflected moral balance, enjoying the fruits of life without falling into indulgence. It was virtue disguised as vanity, a compromise between faith and flesh. The alcohol did its part, mild enough to cleanse but not enough to intoxicate. Doctors quietly approved, noting that wine's acidity fought decay and killed certain bacteria. For the first time, science and superstition met in a glass. Still, the ritual was more emotional than rational. It offered the illusion of control in a world where illness seemed to lurk in every corner. Cholera in the water, typhoid in the food, consumption in the air. If a little wine could protect the mouth, perhaps it could protect the soul. Servants adopted the method too, though theirs was simpler. They rinsed with leftover wine at the end of meals, the same liquid their employers discarded. The warmth spread through the mouth, leaving behind not just freshness, but a faint feeling of comfort, a momentary break from labour. Even in the poorest homes, where the wine was sour and the cups were tin, the gesture remained the same: a rinse, a spit, and a sigh. The day's dust erased, at least from the lips. The scent of wine became part of domestic life. It mingled with the smell of starch, wood polish, and candle smoke, faint but distinct. It carried a trace of something foreign, something alive. In small doses, it hinted at sophistication. Too much, and it became scandal. Women learned to balance the measure carefully, to let the fragrance linger without provoking whispers. Cleanliness, as always, walked hand in hand with reputation. There was pleasure in the ritual, though few admitted it. The slight sting on the tongue, the cool rush of diluted sweetness, the sense of renewal, it all felt indulgent, even sensual. But in a world that punished excess, this small act of self-care was one of the few indulgences allowed. There is something quietly tender in the way they turn decay into beauty, finding grace in the simplest acts of maintenance. Each rinse was a declaration that the mouth, the voice, the very breath could remain untouched by the filth of the world outside. For the wealthy, perfumers soon turned the idea into a business. Bottled grape rinses and vinous tonics appeared in shops, their labels promising refinement and health. Yet the homemade version never vanished. It was too easy, too human, to give up. Even the most elegant lady might still prepare it herself, stirring wine into water with the same care she used to lace her corset. The line between cleanliness and ritual blurred until no one could tell them apart. As the day ended, the same mixture waited on the washstand, faintly fragrant under the lamplight. Women rinsed before bed, spitting into porcelain basins that gleamed white against the dark wood. The faint red swirl that remained at the bottom looked almost beautiful, a reminder that cleanliness, like life, was fleeting and fragile. When the room fell quiet, the scent of grapes hung in the air, mingling with wax and fabric, soft as a memory. Mouths cleansed, mirrors dimmed, and wine diluted into virtue. It was not true purity, but it was close enough to believe in, somewhere nearby. Another custom stirred, one less elegant but just as practical, when heat pressed upon the body and tempers. A cool touch of mint-soaked linen brought relief no perfume could rival. Afternoons in Victorian summers were heavy and airless. The city seemed to hold its breath under a blanket of soot and heat, and every touch of fabric against the skin became a small torment. Clean water was scarce, perfumes were cloying, and soap burned in the warmth. Yet among the many rituals that kept the illusion of freshness alive, one stood out for its grace and simplicity, wiping the hands and neck with linen soaked in mint. The clothes were stored in porcelain jars, their edges damp, faintly cool to the touch. When pressed to the skin, they gave a brief, intoxicating chill, enough to make a lady sigh in relief before returning to her corseted composure. The scent of mint was sharp and bright, cutting through the staleness of the air. It masked the odour of sweat and powder, replaced it with something that felt alive, clean, almost moral. The Victorians did not think of cleanliness as comfort, they thought of it as duty. Mint offered both. Its cooling nature soothed flushed skin, while its antiseptic quality, though few understood the term, kept small infections and irritation at bay. It is almost endearing that they placed their faith in leaves and linen when medicine could not keep the simplest fevers away. Yet the habit worked. A few strokes across the face or neck, and the world felt bearable again. Each woman carried her own mint cloth, folded neatly in a small tin or wrapped in waxed paper. It was not merely a tool of hygiene, but a symbol of self-discipline. To be clean was to be in control, and control was the essence of Victorian femininity. Servants prepared the cloths every morning, boiling mint leaves in water, letting the mixture cool, and soaking strips of linen before wringing them dry. The air was filled with the green, spicy fragrance that clung to every surface. The clothes were then stored in covered bowls to retain their dampness, ready for use throughout the day. When a lady stepped out into the heat, she would touch the cloth lightly to her wrists, her temples, or the back of her neck. The sensation was brief but luxurious, a personal secret hidden beneath layers of fabric and restraint. In carriages, the faint smell of mint mingled with perfume and dust. For those who noticed, it spoke of refinement, of someone who managed discomfort with elegance. If one were to compare it with today, it would be like carrying a packet of cooling wipes scented with peppermint and calling it sophistication. The practice carried quite a hierarchy too. Wealthier women used linen embroidered with their initials, stored in silver cases that gleamed faintly in the light. Their clothes were perfumed with a drop of bergamot or rose to soften the intensity of the mint. Meanwhile, working women used rougher fabric, often cotton, dipped in the same infusion and hung to dry near windowsills. Yet for all their differences, the ritual served the same purpose to maintain dignity in a world that offered little comfort. Clean hands, cool skin, and a fresh scent could mean the difference between exhaustion and composure. The power of scent was immense in those days. The Victorians believed that foul smells carried disease, that miasmas rising from filth could poison the body. Mint, with its crisp, sharp aroma, seemed the perfect antidote. Housewives hung bunches of it by the door, burned it in stoves, and steeped it in their washing water. But the mint-soaked cloth remained the most personal use of all, a small rebellion against the filth that surrounded them. It was the one tool that did not depend on wealth or modernity, only on habit and care. Doctors, too, began to recommend it. The cooling cloth, they claimed, steadied the pulse and prevented fainting during the summer months. For women tightly bound in corsets, breathing in hot weather was already a battle. The mint helped them survive it, or at least appear to. It gave the illusion of vitality, that most valuable of Victorian traits. The pale glow of the skin after wiping away sweat was praised as delicacy, not weakness. In public, no one could see the struggle, only the composure that followed. Even men found use for the ritual. Clerks and travellers kept mint cloths tucked into waistcoat pockets, using them discreetly after long hours in offices or trains. A quick wipe behind the ears, a faint fragrance of leaves, and they felt restored. In a society that prized appearances over comfort, such moments of private renewal were essential. Cleanliness was not a state of being. It was a performance rehearsed daily, quietly, endlessly. There is something quietly human in their pursuit of coolness amid the heat, of calm amid the suffocation. The mint cloths represented more than hygiene. They were fragments of sanity in a world built on repression. To wipe one's skin clean was not just to refresh the body, but to reclaim it, however briefly, from layers of expectation and fabric. The sensation of cold on hot skin felt like freedom disguised as propriety. By evening, the clothes had dried, and their scent faded to a faint whisper. Servants gathered them, washed them, and steeped new ones for the following day. The cycle repeated endlessly through summer boil, soak, wring, cool, wipe, and replace. The repetition itself became comforting, a rhythm of order in the chaos of heat. The smell of mint lingered in bedrooms long after the lamps were blown out, softening the heaviness of air and thought alike. On certain days, the heat was unbearable, and even the mint lost its edge. Women would fan themselves while pressing the cloth to their throats, eyes half closed, waiting for the brief relief to fade. Then they would straighten again, lace their gloves, and continue as though the moment had never happened. No one could see the small rebellions that took place beneath the veneer of decorum, the secret gestures that kept bodies functioning in garments designed for beauty, not breath. Mint leaves, once fresh and green, browned quickly after use, but they were never wasted. Some were dried and reused for scenting drawers or linen cupboards, spreading the same cool fragrance to where hands would later rest. The Victorians, even in their exhaustion, were masters of making use of everything. Nothing was ever simply comfort. Everything was discipline disguised as grace. As the night deepened, and the last of the mint cloths hung drying by the window, the house seemed to exhale. The faint, herbal scent mixed with the warmth of fading candles and the creak of old wood. For a moment, it felt as though the world had been rinsed clean. The body might still ache, the air might still be heavy, but the coolness lingered, proof that even in an age of constraint, small mercies could still be found in a strip of linen and a handful of leaves. The scent of mint would fade by morning, but its memory would remain, the brief illusion of calm in a world of heat and dust. Somewhere nearby, another habit was waiting to replace it, one born not from comfort but from vanity itself. The fine shimmer of powder dusted across the face to hide oil and exhaustion under a soft, deceptive glow. Afternoon light was never kind to a Victorian woman's face. Beneath layers of powder, perfume, and expectation, her skin fought a losing battle against heat and oil. There was no electric fan, no cool room, no safe retreat from the heaviness of corsets and air thick with soot. The slightest sheen on her forehead or nose could undo the illusion of composure she had spent hours building. So she reached into her reticule, a small silk purse tied to her wrist, and drew out a tin of pale dust labelled pearl powder. It looked pure, almost luminous, and felt like nothing at all when brushed across the skin. In truth, it was not made from pearls but from finely ground chalk or lead carbonate, sometimes laced with starch to make it cling. Still, it caught the light beautifully, leaving the illusion of refinement even as it covered exhaustion. The gesture was small but powerful. With a light touch, she dabbed the powder on her nose, her forehead, and the hollow between her eyebrows, pressing just enough to take away the shine. The oily sheen faded, replaced by a matte glow that whispered restraint. It is rather absurd that they hid the signs of life beneath poison, but in the Victorian world, paleness was a virtue worth dying for. The face became a canvas of stillness, colourless but elegant, untouched by the mess of the world. Sweat, laughter, and imperfection were all considered immodest. The powder silenced them. To the Victorians, oil on the face was a sign of disorder. It suggested indulgence, poor health, or moral weakness. Clean, pale skin, by contrast, spoke of self-control. The pearl powder's dull shimmer became the mark of refinement, a way to erase evidence of fatigue or desire. Women carried it everywhere, tucked between handkerchiefs and tiny mirrors. A quick dusting before stepping into the company restored the mask that society required. If compared with today, it would be like blotting away oil with paper made of chalk and pretending it was luxury skincare. The powders were sold in small jars, often decorated with images of swans, lilies, or Roman goddesses, symbols of purity and calm. The advertisements promised a luminous complexion without blemish, though they never mentioned what the ingredients did to the skin beneath. Over time, the constant layering dried the face, cracked it, and left rashes that could not heal. But women persisted. They believed in appearances more than in comfort, in the smooth illusion of porcelain skin that separated the refined from the unrefined. Servants and factory girls used cheaper versions, made from rice flour or crushed limestone. They mixed it with a hint of rosewater or vinegar and applied it the same way. Even those who could not afford beauty followed the same code. To shine was to fail, to look pale was to belong. The faint dust that covered their cheeks felt like armour, invisible yet powerful, in crowded rooms, under gaslight that revealed every imperfection. A matte face was proof of self-mastery. Some women took the ritual further. Before gatherings, they spread the powder over the entire face and neck, layering it until it blurred the edges of reality. Under candlelight, the skin glowed faintly white, almost ethereal. Men called it angelic. Women knew better. It was labour, daily, endless. To maintain that perfection required constant vigilance. They carried small brushes made from squirrel hair, designed to dust away the oil that kept returning like guilt. The gesture was repeated so often it became instinctive, a motion performed without thought, like breathing or prayer. The scent of the powder was faintly metallic, sometimes sweetened with lavender or rose. It clung to gloves, to mirrors, to the inside of handbags. Even the air of a lady's parlour carried its trace, a softness that hovered between cleanliness and decay. Some powders were tinted slightly pink or ivory, but most remained ghostly white, echoing the era's obsession with purity. A spotless complexion was seen as moral superiority made visible. To glisten was to slip into sin. There were warnings, of course. Doctors began to notice women with trembling hands, pale lips, and failing eyesight, all symptoms of lead poisoning. But denial came easily to a society that valued appearances more than truth. Better to die beautiful, some said, only half in jest. The irony was cruel. The very substance that gave them their spotless appearance was corroding them from within. Still, they dusted their faces each morning, adjusting their veils and smiling through the faint dizziness that followed. There is something hauntingly beautiful about how they turned vanity into endurance, suffering into elegance. The pearl powder was more than makeup. It was a language of silence, a way to hide emotion and fatigue behind a calm facade. To appear unbothered was survival. To remain pale in a dark, polluted world was defiance. Not all used it for beauty alone. Some women swore it helped with rashes or sunburns, and others rubbed it into their gloves to absorb sweat. Even men occasionally brushed a bit on their noses before formal occasions, though they never admitted it. The powder blurred the lines of gender as it did of imperfection. Everyone, in one way or another, participated in the performance of purity. At the end of the day, mirrors told the truth that society would not. The powder had settled into fine lines, the face beneath it weary, the illusion cracking. But even then, the ritual continued. A soft cloth, dampened with vinegar or rose water, wiped the day's effort away, leaving behind a faint ghost of white on the towel. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again, another layer, another illusion. The fine dust of false pearls floated through the dim rooms of Victorian life, shimmering like fragments of sunlight trapped in the air. It covered exhaustion, soot, and sorrow, leaving only stillness behind. Yet beneath that stillness, life continued to breathe, to sweat, to resist. Cleanliness, once again, was just another name for concealment. Beyond the pale silence of powdered faces, another fragrance waited to reclaim the room, not from vanity this time, but from comfort itself. It came from a humble ritual, where herbs met boiling water, and steam carried purity through the air that no powder could ever cleanse. In many Victorian homes, The kitchen was the beating heart of daily life, though it seldom smelled pleasant. Between coal smoke, boiled meat, and the lingering damp of unwashed walls, the air was thick and heavy, clinging to hair and fabric alike. Cleanliness was a luxury, and perfumed air was something reserved for parlours and drawing rooms. Yet women, ever inventive in small acts of survival, found their own way to make domestic air bearable. They would toss herbs, fruit peels, and dried leaves into the same pots used for cooking and let them simmer gently. The steam that rose from these improvised brews carried the scent of another world, a brief illusion of freshness in homes otherwise steeped in soot and labour. The practice required no expense, only foresight. Bits of orange peel saved from breakfast, a handful of mint, a stick of cinnamon, or a sprig of rosemary all went into the pot once the cooking was done. The leftover heat kept the water warm, and soon the air filled with a comforting sweetness that softened the odour of lard and ash. It is oddly touching that the same hands that stirred stew for hours also brewed comfort from scraps. The scent curled through narrow hallways, wrapping around furniture, curtains, and even the iron stove that had blackened with years of use. Victorian kitchens rarely had ventilation. Windows were few, and chimneys often clogged. The smell of coal smoke clung to everything, from lace collars to the hems of dresses. Using herbs as air purifiers became both a necessity and a ritual. Housewives swore that the steam kept away sickness, that the vapours of mint and thyme purified not just the air but the mind. It was science and superstition woven together. A clean-smelling home was considered moral, foul air hinted at neglect. The scent of herbs, then, became a quiet declaration that one was managing well, even if the reality was otherwise. The ingredients varied by season. In winter, cloves and cinnamon gave warmth. In summer, mint and orange peel cooled the air. Sometimes lavender was added, especially before guests arrived. The effect was subtle but transformative, the sharp edge of grease replaced by a soft, dry sweetness that lingered long after the fire went out. If one were to imagine a modern version, it would be like using scented candles to mask the odour of last night's dinner, pretending the calm was effortless. The steam also served another purpose. It moistened the air. Coal fires left rooms dry and throats sore, especially during long winters. The herbal water, left to simmer quietly, restored humidity and made breathing easier. Mothers often leaned over the pot, letting the warmth soothe tired skin, while children inhaled the minty air as if it were medicine. Though few understood the science behind it, the relief was real. The ritual became a kind of therapy long before such words existed. The choice of herbs told stories of class and region. In city apartments, where space was scarce, women used dried mint, lemon peel, and vinegar. In the countryside, they had access to fresh thyme, sage, and chamomile picked from the garden. Each home had its own signature scent. Neighbours could tell who was boiling what just by the fragrance drifting out the window. There was pride in that. The scent became an invisible emblem of order, proof that even in a world ruled by grime, a woman could command her space through care and cleverness. For the wealthy, perfuming the air was a matter of elegance. They burned incense or used imported oils in ornate burners shaped like swans or urns. But the poor relied on what nature provided, a pot of water, a few herbs, and patience. When the air began to fill with fragrance, the home felt momentarily transformed. Even if the wallpaper was peeling and the floorboards creaked, the scent of mint and orange peel gave an illusion of serenity. In that moment, the line between luxury and survival blurred. The sound of the pot bubbling quietly in the background became part of the rhythm of the day. Steam fogged the kitchen windows, softening the outlines of the world outside. For a brief time, everything seemed gentler, slower. Women paused to breathe it in before returning to scrubbing or sewing. There is something profoundly peaceful in the thought that a handful of herbs could make a world of difference in a life defined by repetition. Clean air became an act of resistance, a whisper of beauty inside the relentless machinery of domestic life. At night, when the fires dimmed and the kitchen cooled, the water would be poured away, the herbs thrown into the garden or ashes. Their scent lingered faintly on the walls, a reminder that comfort had existed, however briefly. By morning, the same ritual began again. Boil, breathe, and believe that cleanliness was within reach. The routine brought rhythm to lives measured by tasks and time. Some doctors began to write about the health benefits of aromatic steam, claiming it reduced melancholy and cleared the lungs. Perhaps they were right, or perhaps the women who discovered it had always known instinctively what soothed the body and the mind. It was not medicine in the formal sense. It was something gentler, a domestic cure made from faith, habit, and necessity. The Victorians lived surrounded by smells, horse manure from the streets, smoke from chimneys, unwashed clothes, and the faint metallic scent of illness. Against all that, the soft perfume of herbs felt miraculous. It was a reminder that even in the smallest homes, one could still carve out a corner of grace. By the time the last curl of steam rose and disappeared into the ceiling, the kitchen felt calmer, cleaner, almost holy. The faint sweetness of cinnamon and mint lingered in the air long after silence returned. It was a moment of peace carved from routine, a fragment of beauty born from survival. The scent spoke not of wealth or leisure, but of persistence, the quiet triumph of turning labour into care, and care into comfort. The scent of mint and orange peel eventually faded, leaving behind a calm stillness that felt almost sacred after the noise of boiling pots and crackling fires. In that brief quiet, the air itself seemed to sigh, as if grateful for being cleaned by such simple care. Within that same peace, another remedy waited, one not meant for the air at all, but for the body, where comfort was carved from the skin of a humble vegetable. Among the many quiet struggles of Victorian life, the feet bore the most silent burden. Days spent walking cobblestone streets or standing for hours in heavy boots left the skin of the heels cracked and sore. Shoes were often stiff, made from thick leather that rubbed and pressed with every step. For women, corsets restricted their movement, but for both rich and poor, the feet were rarely spared. There were few creams, no modern lotions, and little time for rest. Yet within the narrow kitchens where potatoes were peeled for dinner, a simple comfort was found. Someone noticed that the soft flesh inside the potato peel eased the sting of dry skin, and so an unlikely ritual began, one that turned waste into relief. After peeling the day's potatoes, women saved the discarded skins in a bowl. The peels were cool and moist, their starchy surface smooth against the fingers. When rubbed gently over rough heels, they softened the cracks and soothed the soreness left from long days. The starch acted as a natural emollient, sealing small wounds and calming irritation. It is strangely poetic that comfort for the weary came not from apothecaries, but from kitchen scraps bound for the bin. The act was humble, even comical to outsiders, yet deeply practical. A woman could tend to her tired feet while preparing supper. The line between labour and care blurred beyond recognition. Victorian homes had little room for luxury, and self-care often took the form of small improvisations. Potatoes were cheap, available year-round, and their peels, normally thrown away, offered a kind of rustic balm. Some women added a few drops of vinegar, believing it cleansed the skin and enhanced the effect. Others mixed the peels with warm water, creating a light paste to smear over the soles and toes. It was not elegant, but it worked. In modern times, the idea would seem absurd, like using leftover vegetable scraps instead of a spa treatment, but the results were surprisingly similar. Foot care was not discussed openly. To have cracked heels was considered a private shame, especially among women who valued appearance and modesty. Yet it was nearly universal. Long skirts brushed against dirty streets, stockings trapped sweat, and poor ventilation meant constant dampness. Potatoes, strangely enough, offered a kind of redemption. Their starch drew out moisture and softened hardened calluses. Women found comfort in this quiet ritual at the end of the day, sitting by the hearth with their skirts lifted just enough to reach their feet, rubbing slowly until the skin felt renewed. The smell of the peels mingled with that of burning coal and simmering stew, creating a scent that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply familiar. In such moments, cleanliness was less about appearance and more about the relief of small discomforts. These were lives defined by constant endurance, and every improvised remedy felt like an act of quiet defiance. The line between cleanliness and survival blurred once more, proving that necessity was still the best teacher of invention. Some doctors scoffed at such household tricks, calling them superstitions, but others, more observant, noted the natural softening power of starch and even recommended similar poultices for cracked hands or chapped lips. The Victorians were surrounded by natural ingredients: vinegar, herbs, clay, and ash, and they used them all without hesitation. They trusted what they could see and feel, not what they were told in advertisements. The potato peel may not have cured the disease, but it healed in its own small way. Foot care, though rarely spoken of, carried deep significance. The feet were the foundation of daily life. To walk pain-free meant to work, to care, to endure another day. Every act of tending to them was an acknowledgement of fatigue, a silent thank you to the body for carrying its burdens without complaint. In this way, the humble potato peel became something like a prayer, whispered through the motions of rubbing, rinsing, and resting. It was not just women who practiced it. Men who worked in fields or factories also found relief in this trick. They might not speak of it, but word spread quietly through homes and workshops alike. A handful of potato peels could soothe what long hours had cracked. The simplicity of it all reflected the deeper truth of Victorian hygiene that cleanliness was rarely glamorous, often desperate, and deeply human. Something is moving in knowing that care could exist even in the smallest gestures, carved out of exhaustion and necessity. The ritual was often performed at dusk, when the day's noise had softened and the hearth glowed faintly. Feet propped on a stool, fingers sticky with starch, the body surrendered to rest. When the peels dried, they were thrown back into the fire, where they crackled and vanished, their usefulness complete. Tomorrow, the same act would repeat, as unchanging as the chime of the clock or the turning of the key in the door. These quiet customs were part of a larger truth about the Victorian household. Cleanliness was an illusion built from constant maintenance, 1,000 daily acts of wiping, scrubbing, and polishing. None of it lasted, but that was never the point. What mattered was the effort, the faith that renewal could always be made from what remained. By the time the peels cooled and the feet softened, the small victory of the moment was enough. The soreness dulled, the cracks eased, and the act itself felt soothing beyond its purpose. It was not vanity, nor science, but something between the two, a merging of instinct and patience, passed down through generations of women who knew how to find relief where there seemed to be none. The fire eventually dimmed, and the smell of potatoes gave way to the faint odour of cooling ash. In that soft quiet, the room seemed cleaner somehow, though nothing visible had changed. The comfort was internal, invisible, and real. The steam faded, but the warmth remained, clinging to the air like gratitude. This was not a miracle cure, only a reminder that care does not require wealth. Beyond that kitchen, another method waited, one born not from warmth or softness, but from friction, where black dust and salt combined to polish what words alone could not. Before sunrise, the hearths of Victorian homes still held faint traces of the night's fire. What remained after the embers cooled was black dust, soft as ash yet strong enough to stain fingertips. That dust, charcoal, was never wasted. In a world where nothing was easily thrown away, even soot found its use. When mixed with salt and a few drops of water, it became something both primitive and practical, a homemade paste to scrub the mouth clean. There was a strange logic in it, to use the very thing that blackened chimneys to whiten teeth. To modern eyes, it seems absurd, but in the quiet kitchens of the 19th century, this mixture was ordinary. Soap and toothpaste were luxuries, their ingredients expensive and often unavailable to the poor. Instead, people reached for what they had burnt wood, ground finely with stones, and salt gathered from the sea. The coarse grains cut through residue, while the charcoal absorbed smells left from meals cooked over smoky stoves. A pinch on a damp cloth or even a finger was enough to scrape away the day's bitterness. The taste was harsh, the texture gritty. Yet many swore it worked better than anything sold in apothecaries. Charcoal drew out odour and oil, while salt purified the gums. Some added a drop of peppermint oil or crushed herbs for freshness, though such additions were luxuries in themselves. For the working class, simplicity ruled. To brush with charcoal was not about vanity but survival. Teeth meant health, and health meant work. Morning routines were quick. The air was cold, water scarce, and fire still low. A small bowl of black powder sat beside the basin, the colour of soot against the pale porcelain. A woman would wet her cloth, dip it lightly into the powder, and rub it across her teeth until her gums tingled. Her reflection in the small mirror was dim, half lit by dawn. When she rinsed, the water darkened instantly, carrying away ashen residue in swirling grey lines. The result was not perfect whiteness, but a feeling of cleanliness rare in a time when sugar, smoke, and decay were constant. It is oddly fitting that Victorian cleanliness so often came from contradiction, scrubbing dirt with dirt, washing skin with alcohol, and whitening smiles with soot. Each act carried a kind of irony that only poverty could invent. Yet the effect was undeniable. Charcoal is cleaned not only by abrasion, but also by absorption. It clung to impurities and drew them away. A primitive chemistry learned by instinct. Long before laboratories confirmed its properties, the poor had already mastered its use. In wealthier homes, more refined powders existed, bicarbonate of soda, crushed coral, or even burnt bread ground to dust. But the essence was the same. To keep one's mouth fresh was not only about hygiene, but about civility. A clean mouth was a mark of discipline, a silent statement that one was respectable even when life offered little else. The contrast between gleaming smiles and coal-black stoves was almost poetic, though few would have seen it that way. The act of brushing was also one of reflection. There was quiet in it, a pause before the day began. For many women, it was one of the few moments spent alone. In the reflection of a fogged mirror, the mixture of black powder and water turned the mouth into a strange mask, one that seemed grotesque yet humanly tender. When the rinsing ended, the water cleared and the mask was gone, leaving only the faint taste of salt and smoke. Some used burnt rosemary stems or bread crusts when charcoal was unavailable. Others mixed the black powder with vinegar, believing the acidity killed invisible germs. Whatever the variation, the purpose was always the same: to remove the trace of yesterday. In a time before dental care, this crude mixture was their shield against rot and odour. Cavities were common, pain inevitable, yet these improvised efforts slowed the decay. It is difficult now to imagine the smell of those mornings: coal smoke drifting from chimneys, damp fabric drying near fires, the sharp tang of salt and charcoal in the air. The combination must have been both harsh and strangely comforting. Cleanliness was not about scent or shine, but about endurance. To scrape one's teeth clean was to declare, however silently, that decay would not win so easily. Something is humbling in realizing that survival often depended on knowledge so simple it required no schooling. Every home was a small laboratory of necessity. Housewives knew which powders cleansed, which burned, which soothed. They used what they could, when they could, without complaint. As the century moved on, advertisements began to replace experience. Brightly labelled toothpaste tins promised purity, freshness, and modern refinement. The black grit of charcoal faded from households, replaced by soft white pastes and mint-flavoured comforts. Yet the principle remained the same, the desire to feel clean, to remove what the world had left behind. Even as science advanced, the impulse stayed unchanged to wipe away the visible proof of struggle, to begin the day without yesterday's marks. The simplicity of the charcoal mixture carried something almost spiritual. It was a ritual of renewal, not perfection. No one expected brilliance, only relief. That small moment in front of the mirror, dark powder turning to foam, was an act of quiet dignity. The reflection of a woman's face in that dim glass, her mouth blackened by soot, yet her eyes calm, captured the contradiction of Victorian life itself. To appear pure, one had to first touch impurity. To stay clean, one had to work through filth. The irony was not lost on history, but it was survival then, not symbolism. By the time she left the room, her teeth might not have gleamed, but they felt new enough to smile through another day. The bowl of black powder would remain on the table, waiting for morning to return, as faithful and unassuming as the habit itself. The morning soot became a symbol of resilience more than cleanliness, a small act repeated by countless hands through countless years. What came after was another ritual of endurance, one that began where the body met the ground, where stones and steps offered both pain and comfort. In a time when every step carried the weight of survival, Victorians learned to find comfort in the most unlikely places, even inside their shoes. The feet, weary from endless walking on cobblestone streets and wooden floors, bore the silent record of each day's labour. Hard soles, heavy boots, and poorly fitted shoes turned walking into endurance. Blisters and swelling were part of life, accepted without complaint. Yet within this world of constant strain, a quiet innovation appeared: the placement of small, smooth stones inside the shoes. It was crude and strange, but for many it worked. Stones gathered from riverbeds or gardens were washed and chosen carefully. They had to be rounded enough not to wound, small enough to move beneath the arch of the foot. When placed inside worn leather shoes, they pressed lightly against the skin, shifting with each step. The pressure, though unusual at first, created a sensation that Victorians believed could awaken circulation, soothe fatigue, and even stimulate the body's hidden energy points. It is both ridiculous and fascinating that comfort could come from walking on stones, but in the language of necessity, it made perfect sense. After long hours spent scrubbing floors, standing by factory machines, or walking to market, the small pebbles inside the shoes offered a kind of moving massage. Each step became a rhythm of pressure and release, pain and relief intertwined. There was no luxury of rest, no notion of foot baths or medical care. The stones were their therapy, nature's simplest tool for bodies that never stopped moving. Women who worked as housemaids or laundresses used this method most often. They had no time to sit, and their feet bore the cost of duty. The shoes they wore were often old, their linings thin, their heels collapsing inward. Yet the small stones inside turned hardship into something tolerable. The sensation was strange but grounding, a reminder of the body's presence amid repetition. Some even claimed that after a week, their feet no longer ached as before. The idea spread quietly. It was not advertised or written about in pamphlets, but passed from one tired worker to another. Some men used it during long walks to construction sites or on farms, while older women used it at home while cleaning. The body, through pain, found a crude balance. Victorian medicine spoke of humours and circulation, while common folk spoke of energy and blood flow. Between those words, something real was happening. Pressure, awakening nerves, fatigue fading under repetition. To imagine this today is to see the absurdity of it. It would be like slipping gravel into sneakers and calling it wellness. Yet modern reflexology is built on the same logic. Each pebble pressing into the sole of a Victorian foot mirrored what we now call massage therapy, stripped of polish and science, but not of truth. The body knew what it needed long before the language of anatomy explained it. The scene inside a Victorian kitchen at dusk revealed much about this ritual. Shoes placed neatly by the door still held their secret stones, warmed by the heat of the body that wore them. A faint imprint of each pebble remained in the worn leather, like memory pressed into matter. When the shoes were emptied, the stones were washed, set on the windowsill to dry, and ready to serve again the next morning. This small repetition carried both comfort and superstition, as though the stones absorbed the day's exhaustion only to return strength by dawn. There was something almost meditative about it. To walk on stones was to accept discomfort as a kind of healing, to turn pain into rhythm. It echoed the Victorian belief that endurance purified, that the body was made stronger by hardship. Pain, in its own way, became a sign of control. I find it quietly remarkable that people who owned so little could find such meaning in the simple act of walking, transforming necessity into care with nothing but patience and a handful of stones. Not everyone understood it. Some saw it as foolishness, others as a strange charm against fatigue. But for those who practiced it, it was a way of reclaiming their bodies from work. In a society obsessed with discipline and restraint, even this private act felt subversive, a reminder that comfort need not be earned, only found. The rhythm of stone against skin created a steady pulse, grounding the mind. It was the soundless hum of existence, a bodily awareness that words could not describe. For the Victorian poor, who rarely spoke of pain, this was their therapy, cheap, silent, and effective enough to keep them standing another day. It was one of many small miracles born from scarcity. In the dim light of gas lamps, a woman might remove her shoes and shake the stones into her hand. She would look at them as if they held some secret of resilience, the dull grey glinting faintly under the light. To anyone else, they were meaningless, but to her, they were companions in the day's labour, her private cure for the ache that came from survival. The simplicity of the act remained striking even now. The stones did not heal, but they reminded the body that it was still alive, still capable of movement, still connected to the ground. They turned walking into an act of awareness rather than mere endurance. In a world where cleanliness, beauty, and comfort were luxuries, these small gestures became expressions of care, proof that dignity could exist even beneath exhaustion. When the shoes were set aside for the night, the house grew quiet again. Outside, the streets echoed with the faint clatter of carriage wheels. Inside, the smooth pebbles cooled on the windowsill, waiting for morning. The day's fatigue had been shared, absorbed, and set aside like dust shaken from an old coat. Pebbles cooled on the sill like forgotten companions, their round forms still carrying the warmth of tired feet. In that small silence between dusk and dawn, they became symbols of endurance, not ornaments of comfort. Beyond their stillness waited another kind of care, one that hung gently from the air itself, carrying the scent of herbs meant to cleanse what no hand could touch. In the quiet corners of Victorian homes, where light from the windows dimmed and air refused to move, the battle against smell was constant. The household toilet, often tucked away behind heavy curtains or built as a narrow wooden closet, was a place of silence and endurance. Plumbing was still an uncertain science, and drains had minds of their own. Moisture clung to the walls, and air carried the damp scent of earth, soap, and decay. Yet, even here, among the most unpleasant corners of the home, there existed a ritual of care, one as delicate as it was determined. It began with a small linen pouch filled with herbs. The pouch was nothing extraordinary to look at, stitched by hand, tied with a frayed string. Inside were crushed lavender flowers, mint leaves, and thin curls of dried orange peel. These were not luxuries, but the remains of what could be spared. Housewives dried herbs in their kitchens, saving whatever fragments they could after meals or medicines were made. When combined, they formed a subtle fragrance that mingled sweetness with sharpness, enough to mask what could not be removed. It is oddly charming that in an age of coal and grime, people still believed a handful of flowers could outmatch the stench of daily life. The pouch was hung by a nail, or sometimes from the handle of a door, swaying lightly whenever someone passed. It did not cleanse, it did not purify, yet it gave an illusion of order, and for the Victorians, that illusion mattered deeply. Cleanliness was not always possible, but the appearance of it was a duty. A fresh pouch each week became a small ceremony. To replace it meant to reclaim a sense of control over what was unmanageable, to say that even filth could be softened by intention. The act of hanging those pouches was almost devotional. Women prepared them on Sundays after laundry was finished, pressing herbs into cloth while the house smelled faintly of soap and damp linen. The fragrance, faint though it was, carried a promise of civility into spaces no one wished to linger in. The room changed character when the scent of lavender entered it. For a few days, it became tolerable, almost pleasant, before humidity began to win again. Victorian homes were full of contradictions like this. Beauty was built upon discomfort, refinement upon labour. The smallest gestures of order stood against the chaos of disease and decay. A perfumed pouch in a privy might seem insignificant, but it was a declaration that one could live gracefully even when surrounded by the opposite. It is not so different from today, when people buy scented candles to mask the smell of cities. They too are chasing the same quiet dignity through fragrance. The contents of each pouch were chosen carefully. Lavender was known for calm, mint for freshness, and orange peel for warmth. Together they formed a scent that shifted with temperature, sweet in the morning, sharp by evening. The women who made them understood balance without needing instruction. A little too much mint and the scent turned harsh, too much lavender and it grew cloying. Their skill lay not in luxury but in knowing when enough was enough. Replacing the pouch each week became a rhythm of its own. When a new one was hung, the old was burned in the hearth, sending its final breath of fragrance into the kitchen before turning to ash. That tiny plume of smoke carried something symbolic, a merging of purity and waste, the constant cycle of Victorian domestic life. What had once fought odour became fuel for warmth. In this way, nothing was wasted, not even the effort to stay clean. Some families hung these pouches not only in toilets, but in wardrobes, hallways, or near beds. It was believed that certain herbs drove away insects and illness alike. Mint repelled flies, lavender soothed the mind, and orange peel kept mildew from growing. These beliefs blurred the line between science and superstition, but they gave meaning to monotony. Every movement of the pouch, every faint rustle when the door opened, reminded the household that cleanliness was a choice, not a condition. The scent filled not only rooms but also memories. Guests remembered which home smelled faintly of lavender or citrus, and such impressions mattered deeply in polite society. A home that smelled clean was a home that seemed moral. The Victorians, who believed the state of one's house reflected the state of one's soul, found comfort in these fragrant illusions. In poorer districts, where filth was unavoidable, the same pouches hung from nails driven into cracked walls. They didn't last long. The air was too damp, the smells too strong, but for a few days they gave people the feeling of refinement that poverty had denied them. The scent of herbs mingled with the odour of coal smoke and mould, forming a perfume unique to the age, half nature, half endurance. These pouches, small as they were, also marked time. A fresh scent meant a new week had begun, a reminder that decay could always be reset, even if only briefly. It gave people hope that the world could be managed, that care could conquer filth, that beauty could still exist in the smallest of forms. There is something deeply human in that, to fight rot not with strength or wealth, but with the fragile confidence of fragrance. The habit survived generations, changing shape with the centuries. The linen pouch became a glass jar, the herbs became manufactured soaps, and later, perfumed sprays. Yet the desire remained the same. Each age found its way to believe that scent could disguise imperfection, that air could be civilized with effort. In the end, perhaps it was never about cleanliness at all, but about the longing for control in a world that constantly decayed. At night, when candles were blown out and silence returned, the scent of lavender and mint lingered. It mixed with the smell of wood and wax, a quiet echo of care. The pouch hung still, doing nothing yet meaning everything. It stood for hope in its smallest form, the belief that tomorrow's air would smell better, even if only for a while. Fragrance became memory, and memory became comfort, wrapping the night in softness that only those who had lived through filth could appreciate. In that suspended air, the home breathed peace, as fragile as the herbs that created it. Beyond this gentle ritual of hanging and replacing, another custom waited, one that brought not fragrance to the room, but sharpness to the morning, where the first cloth touched the skin and the day began anew. Morning in a Victorian home began not with perfume or luxury, but with the faint scent of vinegar, soap, and, on rare occasions, red wine. For those who believed that cleanliness was a moral act, every inch of the body required its own ritual, even the neck, the place where heat and fabric met. The neck was easily forgotten and easily dirtied, pressed by high collars, lace, and corsets that trapped sweat beneath layers of starch and wool. Over time, some women discovered that a small cloth soaked in diluted red wine offered an unexpected form of refreshment. The wine, cooled from the night, was dabbed gently onto the skin to cleanse and tighten it, leaving behind only the faintest tint that faded quickly. The method was simple but effective. Red wine contained natural acids that stripped away the residue of oil and dust, while its alcohol acted as a mild antiseptic. The chill of the damp cloth awakened the senses in a way that plain water could not. For women who rose before dawn to prepare the household, this quick ritual felt like a luxury stolen from the morning. There is something amusingly elegant about turning yesterday's drink into today's skincare. In the soft light of a mirror, the cloth moved slowly along the curve of the neck and collarbone. The colour was gentle, not strong enough to stain, and the skin beneath grew cool and firm. To Victorians, this sensation of tightness was not vanity, it was discipline. A fresh, pale neck symbolised restraint and hygiene, a mark of civility in a world that valued appearances above comfort. Even the faint sting of the wine was a reminder of control, proof that cleanliness demanded a touch of suffering. Some households used cheaper wine for this purpose, wine that had soured or been left unfinished after supper. Waste was frowned upon, and to repurpose it for cleansing was considered both clever and thrifty. The same bottle that had graced a dining table might, the next morning, become part of a beauty ritual. This circular economy of care defined Victorian domestic life, where every object had multiple lives before being discarded. The scent that lingered afterward was subtle, earthy, tangy, and faintly sweet. It mixed with the soap from freshly washed linen and the wax from polished furniture, becoming part of the home's quiet symphony of effort. Women carried that faint fragrance with them through the day, a hidden token of the morning's discipline. It was not perfume in the modern sense, but a kind of personal cleanliness that could not be bought. The practice was whispered between friends, passed through generations of housemaids and governesses. It was rarely written in books, Yet it survived because it worked. If recreated today, it would feel like a handmade version of a luxury toner, an old-world beauty secret hiding beneath the surface of survival. The same principles that guided this act guided much of Victorian hygiene purity through practicality, elegance through effort. For the poor, the ritual was also about protection. In crowded streets and damp houses, bacteria thrived where cloth met skin. A quick wipe with wine reduced infection in small cuts and abrasions. It was medicine disguised as refinement, a balancing act between appearance and necessity. In that way, every drop of wine was both remedy and reassurance. Men, too, adopted the habit in their own way. Some used cloth soaked in brandy or whiskey after shaving, enjoying the sharp burn it left behind. The sting, they believed, proved its strength. Women preferred wine for its gentler touch. Either way, the practice connected the household to the idea of science before science itself was fully understood. A faith that cleanliness could protect against the invisible. The neck, being close to the pulse, carried warmth. When the wine met the skin, it cooled quickly, creating a momentary relief from the constant weight of fabric and corset. That brief freshness was enough to feel renewed, enough to start the day with composure. For women who rarely rested, it was an act of quiet indulgence, a way to reclaim the body before the day's demands consumed it again. The mirror reflected more than faces, it reflected effort. Every stain removed, every scent masked, every drop of liquid wrung from its last use told the same story, survival wrapped in ritual. Victorian life revolved around control, and even this small act fit neatly within that structure. The cloth was folded, rinsed, and hung to dry, ready to serve again the next morning. By evening, the scent of wine was gone, replaced by the weight of the day, coal smoke, sweat, and cooking oil. Yet the feeling of the morning lingered like a promise, the quiet confidence that began with cool skin and steady breath. Small acts like this, performed in solitude, became the foundation of dignity in a society that offered little rest. It is quietly moving to think that cleanliness for Victorians was not about beauty, but about reclaiming a sense of control in a world that rarely allowed it. Each motion, soaking, pressing, wiping, was an assertion of will against decay. They knew that nothing stayed clean for long, but that was never the point. What mattered was the faith in the ritual itself. As the candlelight faded, a folded handkerchief rested on the basin, pale and damp with the last traces of wine. The house fell still. The scent, faint but real, marked the end of one day and the quiet beginning of another. Cleanliness, they believed, was not achieved once but renewed again and again, in small gestures repeated until habit became hope. And so the long list of curious Victorian rituals came to its close. From vinegar on the skin to herbs in the air, from charcoal on the teeth to wine on the neck, each method carried its own strange wisdom, born of scarcity and devotion. They were not elegant by our standards, yet they worked, because they were built from care, patience, and an unshakable belief in order amid chaos. May the memory of their odd yet gentle routines remind us that beauty often hides in simplicity, and that even in the hardest of times, people have always found ways to make themselves feel human. Sleep now, and let the faint scent of lavender and wine drift through your imagination. The night is quiet, the air is clean, and history has already washed its face. Good night. May your dreams be calm, your rest unbroken, and your sleep as peaceful as the still rooms of Victorian England.